Let's get peppy. Welcome to PEEP. This is the extra for PEP194. So yes, that means it's an extra for the extra. That means that if you haven't listened to PEP194 yet, you should turn around and listen to that first, because this is a part 2 for PEP194. On PEEP194, I've got a little bit of Correspondence Central today for you. I've got a lot of executive orders, and I've got a 45-minute interview with the former National Administrator for Women and Special Populations at the Bureau of Prisons. I talked to her largely about how she dealt with transgender prisoners when she was in charge of them, because she literally wrote the book on the guidelines. As of Trump's defending women executive order as well, her guidelines are now in the round file. So I was interested to know what she had to say about that. That is coming up in a few hours. But first, correspondence time. Hit it, Lucky. Hey! Just one topic today. Wildfires. Now, I talked about them, of course, on PEP last week, and we received a lot of correspondence from fireys and their wives, interestingly enough. I felt a lot more informed having read the feedback, so I want to present you with some of it. Firstly, a few people pinged me for using the phrases controlled burning and back burning interchangeably. Those people were, of course, right, and I was wrong, as per usual. This is, for example, from Jamie. Nitpicking, but technically back burning is not controlled burning. Back burning is what firefighters do during an event to burn areas that they predict the fire path will take as an immediate firefighting tactic. Controlled burning is preemptive prevention by burning strategic areas of bush before a bushfire event occurs, usually in cooler non-wind times, which is also becoming more difficult as traditional fire seasons are getting longer and less predictable. Excellent point, Jamie. So backburning is when the fire has already started and you're trying to limit the fire. Controlled burning is long before the fire starts. Big difference. Now, some people took umbrage at my describing so many things that went wrong in LA, so many stuff-ups, and then concluding, hey, the fire would have been wild anyway. It made no consequential difference, I said, as if I had a crystal ball. Well, I got some correspondence which really made me feel like I hadn't completely misled you all. So that was wonderful. It's from Aussie Titan. As an RFS firefighter for 20 years, crew leader qualified and former senior deputy captain who's attended hundreds of local fires, I can assure you that they could have had an extra 100 trucks available and they wouldn't have stopped these fires. In those extreme conditions, it only takes a few minutes for a fire to reach an uncontrollable size. You could put a truck on every second home and all you're doing is endangering firefighters' lives. With winds of 100 kilometers an hour and gusts reaching 160 kilometers an hour, it's impossible to get close enough to get water on those fires. In these conditions, spot fires ignite kilometres ahead of the fire front, which risk creating entrapment scenarios for firefighters. And then he added something else I hadn't heard of at all. As for MAGA's bird brain idea of raking the forest floors, all this would do is lead to increased ground moisture loss, causing flora to die off, which leads to more fuel and erosion. One factor that nobody seems to highlight is residents spending hours hosing down roofs and walls prior to the fire's arrival. Not only is this pointless, as the extreme heat radiation ahead of the fire evaporates all the moisture, it drains water pressure from firefighters on the front line. In this situation, residents should clear their roof/gutters of any debris, place a plastic bag filled with items like socks or tennis balls in the downpipes as a plug, then fill the gutters with water and hope they have no shrubs or trees near their house. The simple truth is, there aren't and never will be enough fire trucks to protect every home in major fires. Thank you, Aussie Titan. That is the voice of experience, which I appreciate because, I got no idea. I'm just telling you what I read. Also, while I'm here, The LA Times, talking about what I read, just added a beauty in the long list of things the LA Mayor's office screwed up. They found a list of about 36 highest priority upgrades compiled by LA County officials in 2013. We're talking new tanks, replaced tanks, upgraded pumping stations, and upgraded water lines. The county wrote that the upgrades would achieve critical goals, including ensuring the system had enough water to meet fire flow needs. The estimated cost of all these upgrades? $57 million. Not much in the scheme of things. It would have taken about 7 years. They did not get it done. Another list was compiled in 2019 of the top 13 most urgent projects costing about $60 million. If they just followed that list, 12 of the 13 projects would have been completed by September, but they didn't. So that is incredibly annoying. And I'm not saying that LA residents shouldn't hold their counties responsible or their mayors responsible. I think, but I mean, look, these people aren't good leaders. But I also think Aussie Titan is right. It was happening anyway. That's enough for now. It's time now for the sting. You've all, well, not all, but I was surprised just how many people have been asking about. It's time for me to be unleashed. Shaz Unleashed. Thank you, Lockie. I'm hoping Lockie's timing this with my singing because I'm singing to nothing at the moment. Singing in inverted commas to nothing. Like I said on PEP, I am aiming to go through all this week's executive orders. Maybe not today, though. I doubt very much I'll get through them all today. I've got so many notes here. But I can take a pretty big chunk out of them, hopefully, and then maybe finish them next week. Maybe, fingers crossed. I'll certainly be doing all the big ones. Of course, we did start this on PEP194. So again, if you haven't heard PEP194, go back and listen to the first executive actions on that. I will not do that tease again today, I promise. Let's get on with it. Let's start with a batch of foreign affairs executive actions. Start with the America First policy. Quote, from this day forward, the foreign policy of the United States shall champion core American interests and always put America and American citizens first. Yes, sir. There is very little specificity in that executive order about what that means. No detail is mentioned. Just put America first, okay? Sure. I imagine people can do that. I'd love to see someone take you to court for not putting America first. I'd love to see how that would be argued. But anyway, next one. I'm not going to spend time on executive orders that are pointless. So there's another foreign affairs one here. A pause on foreign aid. This is not the pause that we talked about in PEP 194. That was a pause on pretty much all spending of a certain kind. But this is specifically foreign aid, primarily under the US aid agency. Here's a quote. It is the policy of the United States that no further United States foreign assistance shall be dispersed in a manner that is not fully aligned with the foreign policy of the President of the United States. All department and agency heads with a responsibility for United States foreign development assistance programs shall immediately pause new obligations and disbursements of development assistance funds. Okay, so they're very specific. Development assistance funds, pending reviews of such programs for programmatic efficiency and consistency with the United States foreign policy to be conducted within 90 days of this order. Okay, so the idea is it's just a 90-day pause maximum, and then it comes back. The responsible department and agency heads, in consultation with the director of OMB, will make determinations within 90 days of this order on whether to continue, modify, or cease each foreign assistance program based upon the review recommendations. Also, it says that the Secretary of State can waive the pause at any point in time for any particular piece of spending. So just development aid for 90 days or less, because if the OMB gets through it faster than 90 days, the review, then it might be sooner than that. They can appeal to the Secretary of State, who can waive it. They're the conditions. And it's supposed to be development aid. That's what this is about. The thing is, though, Rubio took the directive much further, issuing an immediate order to cease not only development aid, but nearly all current foreign aid programs around the globe. There was an exception for emergency food aid, also for foreign military financing, inverted commas, for Israel and Egypt, the two countries who happen to be guarding the exits of Gaza at the moment. So there was no exception for foreign military financing for any other country. So it's just emergency food aid and foreign military financing for Israel and Egypt, the only ones still going, according to Rubio's extra directive. So that's how you get HIV drug supplies getting cut off. That's how you get efforts to restrict outbreaks of monkeypox getting cut off. That's how you get efforts to fight the spread of fentanyl being cut off. The problem is, though, it's all very well to say, oh yeah, it's just a pause, but there's no such thing as a pause when an NGO or a small business is being defunded, even for 90 days, because that means people are going to get fired and expertise is going to be lost. And ironically, it ends up costing more money trying to restart the program again than if you just kept it going in the first place. Meanwhile, China is sitting there the whole time with their $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative, only too happy to invest on their terms when America's moving out. So it's a huge gift to China. There is a constant soft power competition between China and America for connections and ties to the rest of the world. And if America gets out, then China gets in. I should also add that the next day after Rubio's directive, about 60 senior officials from the US aid agency were placed on administrative leave for, quote, resistance to the Trump policy. That is, leaders I'm talking about here, not staffers who normally would leave at this time of the cycle. Trump officials identified, quote, several actions within US aid that appeared to be designed to circumvent the order, they said. I assume officials were trying to sneak funding out to some worthy cause. Now, the Trump administration was trying to play this down. They said these actions were not terminations or furloughs. These actions allow for a thorough and transparent review of the expenditure of all taxpayer dollars per the President's EO and Secretary Rubio's guidance. There have been no furloughs, no termination of contracts or personnel under the Foreign Aid Freeze EO. Fine. But at the same time as this was happening, someone was taking all the photos of US aid staff and those benefiting from US foreign aid down from the US aid office wall. Look at this. We've got a photo right here for you. Look at them. They left a bunch of empty photo frames in a, I think, rather ominous gesture, just lying around. There used to be you here, now you're gone. It sounds to me like someone is trying to get a 2-for-1 here. They're trying to make it a threatening example out of some people, some leaders. Take out the leaders, it scares the underlings, to spread some fear. And they're also trying to get rid of a few more non-MAGA workers that they can replace. By the way, for those wondering, hang on, didn't you just say in PEP194, that's not a plug, I'm just referencing, that this is all illegal because of the Empowerment Control Act? Then they didn't do this according to the Empowerment Control Act. No, this is probably illegal too. But illegal doesn't seem to matter at the moment. I don't know what's going on. I mean, look, there is probably going to be an injunction on this. Well, actually, they might not, because of what I'm about to tell you. The next day, Rubio issues another memo waiving the aid freeze for, quote, life-saving humanitarian assistance, defined as, quote, core life-saving medicine, medical services, food, shelter and subsistence assistance, as well as supplies and reasonable administrative costs as necessary to deliver such assistance. Okay, so what that leaves is programs being frozen that involve diversity, gender, abortion, family planning, transgender surgeries, non-life-saving assistance, etc. Whereas, quote, implementers of existing life-saving humanitarian assistance programs should continue or resume work if they have stopped. So maybe people won't, now they've got the life-saving stuff back, and maybe they won't bother suing them. I'm not sure. The question is, though, what does life-saving mean? Take a program we've talked about a lot on PEP, because it involves PEP, the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. In Africa, it's a life-saving program trying to stop AIDS spreading and help people who have AIDS. They might hand out condoms at times. Is that life-saving, that program, or is it family planning? How do you define what's life-saving and what's not? It's not always easy, sometimes confusing. People, if they're scared they're going to get sacked, might err on the side of not handing out money because they just watched 60 leaders get sacked for handing out money. So these are the problems when you have a reign of terror. Anyway, that's that one. Next one, another foreign affairs one, executive order. This is pulling out of a global tax deal. Now, you might recall that Biden people spent the last 3 years trying to create a worldwide minimum corporate tax of 15%. The reason they did that is to prevent a race to the bottom. You know, want to have a situation where Ireland is charging 10% corporate tax, so every country in the world incorporates in Ireland. And then Bermuda says, no, we'll make it 5%. So everyone incorporates in Bermuda. And then the Bahamas says, no, make it 2%. You don't want to have that situation because that doesn't help anyone. Everyone loses if you do that. So the idea was to set a reasonable minimum corporate tax globally that everyone can live with, and everyone agrees that no country is going to go below that. It's not a law, it's an agreement, it's a compact. But if everyone agrees, then you can maintain that level, whatever it is. And the level that they were going for was 15%. Now, I was very, very suspicious if this would ever happen. I just didn't believe that America would be able to convince people to go along with that, or countries. They did pretty well. They've so far convinced 140 countries to sign on to that just in the last 2 and a bit years, the Biden administration. But, well, this executive order, America has withdrawn from that deal after organising for 140 countries to take part. Although, to be fair, America was never actually officially part of it because Congress would never agree to it. But you know, the president could say nice things. Now the president isn't even doing that. Why wouldn't Trump agree to this, you might ask? Well, look, he might have agreed to a lower minimum tax because in the 2017 tax cut, he had a 10% minimum tax. So maybe the number was the problem. Maybe 15% was the problem. Maybe if it was 10%, he would have gone along with it. I haven't heard him say that. But I don't know what is motivating him. He's never explained why he's so against this deal. I mean, I don't think it was ever going to happen, but I still don't think it was ever going to happen with 140 countries. But look, the fact is, this doesn't ruin it because that was still a fair way away. 140 countries leaves a lot of the countries. And there were some important countries that weren't on board. Australia, for instance. Yay, go Aussie, oi, oi, oi. Canada, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, the UK, that's an important country. The US, as I said, 43% of the tax losses that were falling through the cracks of this so-called deal were enabled by just those 8 countries. So there's a problem. I don't know, maybe they would have eventually got it happening, but they're definitely not going to get it happening in the next 4 years because it's banned. That's the executive order. Next one. Okay, this is a big one. This is one we didn't mention on PEP194. Pardoning January 6 rioters. You probably heard about this. Trump pardoned everyone except for 14 people whose sentences he commuted from the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, and he may end up pardoning them anyway. He's going to evaluate later if they deserve a pardon. He also dismissed all the pending cases, so they're not going to happen anymore. This is, by the way, an incredibly unpopular deal. According to APNORC polling, 21% supported pardoning most people who participated on January 6th. How about all people? I can't even imagine how unpopular that would be. I didn't see anyone poll that, at least not before. I'm sure there'll be a few more polls coming out soon about that. How about the numbers? Okay, so nearly 1,600 people were pardoned or commuted. Somewhere between 900 and 1,000 of those only faced misdemeanor charges, such as trespassing, disorderly conduct, the kind of stuff where if Trump pardoned them, no one would care. Oh, some people would care, but most people wouldn't care. Some people wouldn't care. I haven't spoken to anyone. I don't know. I wouldn't care. Let's be precise. Out of the serious crimes, though, 13 people were charged with seditious conspiracy for orchestrating the attack. At least 379 people were charged with assaulting police or members of the media. At least 287 people were charged with less violent or non-violent felonies. That's a lot of people who probably shouldn't have gone free. How about the people who hit officers? You know about some of those officers. I'm sure you've seen on TV 3 or 4 of them. But did you know that more than 140 officers were injured on January 6th? There are a lot of assaulting officers going on. 169 defendants were charged with using a deadly or dangerous weapon or causing serious bodily injury to an officer. 169. That's not just punching an officer. That's not just clawing at their body armor or whatever. That's a serious charge. Charged with using a deadly or dangerous weapon or causing serious bodily injury to an officer. 169 of them. They've all gone free. Pardoned every single one. Now, were these people treated unfairly? Let's forget about the assaulting officer guys. Let's talk about the trespass guys, the disorderly conduct guys. Let's talk about them. Dream.org, a progressive group that is pushing criminal justice reform, it says that the issues raised by the January 6th defendants, including decrepit jail conditions and overly aggressive prosecutions, they're rampant in the American criminal justice system. And this is what you hear all the time when you talk to someone whose job it is to actually care about criminal justice matters. They all say the same thing, which is, the January 6 guys got dicked around a little bit. At least the non-violent offenders got dicked around a little bit. But that is because they're in the criminal justice system, which sucks. It dicks around everyone. So let's see how long they care about criminal justice issues now they've been pardoned. Were they over-sentenced? Well, obviously everyone's different. But I will say this. The average sentence for someone convicted of assaulting police on January 6 has been about 4 years, which was below national averages for the crime of assaulting police. The question I think we've got to address, though, is why did Trump let them all off? Well, first of all, let's just say he definitely got pushed around by his own support base. They were agitating for him to release them all. I played you on PEP a few months back, at the end of last year, Nick Fuentes saying how insulting it would be if he didn't pardon everyone after they risked their futures for him. He told them that there was this huge disaster, democracy was at risk and the election had been rigged, and they believed him and they acted accordingly. And he can't just let them rot in jail after that. That's what Nick Fuentes was saying. Joey Marino, who's another fanboy, was tweeting out just before Trump was inaugurated, not only should the J6s be pardoned in a mass blanket pardon, they should be given presidential medals of freedom for standing up when the country needed fighters the most. Yes, the violent ones too. So that's the environment in which he was in. And that would have played a role. I mean, we should, I suppose, before I tell you what I think, because I have a theory about this. Before I tell you what I think is the actual reason, though, that he pardoned them all, let me play you what he says. Because he's been asked, of course, a number of times about how he could pardon super violent people. People who use a stun gun on a police officer's head, that kind of stuff. And this is what he had to say.
And we'll take a few questions if you want.
Of the executive orders, you would agree that it's never acceptable to assault a police officer.
Sure.
Right? So then if I can, among those you pardoned, DJ Rodriguez, he drove a stun gun into the neck of a DC police officer who was abducted by the mob that day. He later confessed on video to the FBI and pleaded guilty for his crimes. Why does he deserve a pardon?
Well, I don't know. Was it a pardon? Because we're looking at commutes and we're looking at pardons. Okay, well, we'll take a look at everything. But I can say this. Murderers today are not even charged. You have murderers that aren't charged all over. You take a look at what's gone on in Philadelphia, take a look at what's gone on in LA, where people murder people and they don't get charged. These people have already served years in prison, and they've served them viciously. It's a disgusting prison. It's been horrible. It's inhumane. It's been a terrible, terrible thing. I also say this, you go to Portland, where they wrapped police officers, shot police officers, nothing happened to anybody. You go to Seattle, where they took over a big chunk of the city and people died. Portland, a lot of people died. Wait a minute. And you go also, take a look at Minneapolis, because I was there and I watched it. And if I didn't bring in the National Guard, that city wouldn't even exist today. People were killed and nobody went to jail. So these people have already served a long period of time, and I made a decision to give a pardon. Joe Biden gave a pardon yesterday to a lot of criminals. These are criminals that he gave a pardon to, and you should be asking that question. Why did he give a pardon to all of these people that committed crimes? Why did he give a pardon to the J6 Unselect Committee when they burned and destroyed all documents which showed that they did what was wrong, not me? Wait a minute. Why did they give a pardon to all of his relatives? His brother, who made millions of dollars, to all these different people, he gave pardons. That's the question you should be answering. All right, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Well, I think we can all agree that that was a pathetic effort. The way he just makes simultaneous, parallel excuses that have nothing to do with each other. And he never picks one, and he just turns into gibberish and just tries to change the subject. And then all of a sudden he's saying, oh, well, how about these other people? How about these other people? Because the other people, I mean, he's talking crap about the George Floyd rioters, but even if he wasn't talking crap, I mean, a lot of them were punished. But even if he wasn't talking crap about the George Floyd rioters, what? Because they might have gotten a good deal, therefore people who assault police officers shouldn't go to jail? Is that what he means? Because he doesn't seem to have that attitude about everyone else other than the J6s. He still seems to be all about throwing people in jail and swallowing the key. So it's a frustrating set of excuses he comes up with. But let's forget that. Let's go to JD Vance for a second, as I often do. Remember when JD Vance said this?
I think it's very simple. Look, if you protested peacefully on January the 6th and you've had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned. And there's a little bit of a gray area there.
Now, some people have said he got over his skis a little bit and Trump hadn't made up his mind yet. And it's basically JD Vance's fault. I don't think JD Vance is the kind of guy who shoots his mouth off. He knows how to avoid a question when he wants to avoid a question. I've seen him do it many times. He deliberately went out of his way to answer that question. And he answered it in a wrong way, in a way that embarrasses him and embarrasses his administration. It creates a contradiction, which the press can then pry open. I've seen MAGA people being asked about JD Vance about 20 times. It's a real problem. So why would he set himself up like that? This is my theory. My theory is that they were going to only pardon non-violent offenders, that they had a strategy and J.D. Vance knew what it was, and so he foreshadowed it. That's why J.D. Vance went out of his way to say that, because he knew that's what they were going to do. But then things changed. I put to you some behind-the-scenes articles that have been printed by a number of publications that suggested that, in fact, they were trying to do a case-by-case review. But the problem was, it was really hard, and it was tough for them. There's 1,500, 1,600 people, cases they're going through case by case. Some of them are tricky. It's not always clear what's happening in the case. That some people might be more violent, might be less violent outside January 6th. There'll be all kinds of factors. It would be difficult. And Trump's new people, maybe they're not quite as professional as his old people were. Maybe he used to have Don McGahn doing this kind of stuff. Don McGahn, who was an absolute pro. And maybe now he's got Pam Bondi doing this stuff, who's not bad, but she ain't Don McGahn. Maybe he's gone from the A graders in some instances, and in others the B graders, at the beginning of his term I'm talking about. And he's now turned them into the D graders and the E graders, and they just can't pull off these kinds of missions. Either way, what's reported is that they struggled real hard, and Trump just said, quote, "Fuck it, release them all." That's the quote. "Fuck it, release them all." Now, that's not a surprise from Trump. That's his usual impulsivity. I believe that he said that. But in the first term, his people would have talked him down. That's where Don McGahn would have said, no, you're not doing that. And he would have explained why. They would have rounded off his edges. They would have hidden the paper that he wanted to write his plans on if they needed to. They would have done whatever they can to make sure he didn't have a big screw up. This time, though, his people would have just let it happen. That's my theory. My theory is that the reason he let them all go is a reflection of how the second term staff are different from the first term staff. And he never would have done that in the first term because his staff wouldn't have let him. Now the staff let him. They're incompetent and they're also permissive. That's a bad combination. That's how you see the real Trump come through. And this is the real Trump. So I suspect we're going to see a lot more of this in the second term. Another example of this attitude, House Speaker Mike Johnson. He said, quote, "The president's made his decision. I don't second guess those." Huh? Dude, you're the Speaker of the House. It's your actual job to second guess Trump's decisions. It's not my job, but it's your job, Mike Johnson. You're saying you don't do that? That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. While I think that Mike Johnson is more competent than people give him credit for, he's not as competent as, say, John Boehner or speakers of the past, or certainly not Nancy Pelosi. And he's a lot more permissive than any of those speakers. So that's how second term goes. Now, obviously, the hypocrisy of J6 pardons going through is infuriating. Because like I said, Trump's still supposed to be Mr. Tough on crime. Literally, at the same time as this order was going out, he was either writing or sending out or signing the Restoring the Death Penalty order, which was calling for prosecutors to be tougher on violent crime. Quote, "The Attorney General shall appropriately prioritise public safety and the prosecution of violent crime," while he's letting violent criminals go. It's shocking. The question is, though, I guess, what happens if these guys go on to commit other crimes? They're violent. They certainly will feel impunity after they've just been jailbroken, and they feel like they've gotten away with it, and they feel like their protector is still in power for the next 4 years, maybe more. We saw an example of this the other day, actually, what's going to happen. Edgar Welsh was shot dead the other day. He's one of the J6s. He pulled a gun on cops when they tried to arrest him at a traffic stop, and they shot him dead. Did you hear about that? I think most people barely heard about that at all. In fact, I think most people didn't hear about that at all. So maybe that's an indication of what's going to happen if others commit crimes. I'm feeling a bit cynical at the moment. To be fair, we did know this was coming, though. I mean, I do want to give, this is a strange thing to say after all this, but I do want to give Trump the most minor of props, which was that while pardoning everyone was a surprise, of all the dodgy pardons that have occurred in the last 2 weeks, so many dodgy pardons, this one did have the most warning. Like, he ran on pardoning J6s. Not all of the violent ones. Like, he at times said that he'd have to think about the violent ones. But he was very explicit that he would be pardoning a large number of them and on day one. He was very explicit about that. So, and he ran on that. And then, literally the day he was inaugurated, he did it. What he said he was going to do. He didn't even try to hide it beforehand. I mean, there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for, in a democracy, if you want to do something incredibly unpopular and something that most people are going to hate, you say you're going to do it before the election. And then straight after the election, you do it. You don't try and sneak it in 20 minutes before you stop being president, Joe Biden. You do it proudly on day one because you said you were going to do it. And people vote you in anyway. That's kind of democracy. I'm going to be saying that a lot over the next 4 years, I suspect. That's kind of democracy. That's what I say whenever I really don't like something. But I have to acknowledge that it is what the people asked for, in a way, under our system. So, yeah, look, I'll give him credit for that. Yeah, there was nothing sneaky about it. He was very upfront. What more can you ask for other than him not pardoning violent criminals? Finally, also with January 6th, the next stage has already begun, which is the inquiries into the inquiries. There's a House inquiry that's just ginning up into the January 6th inquiry. We'll talk more about that at some point in time, I'm sure. Edward R. Martin Jr., the interim U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., has also asked 2 of his prosecutors in his office to undertake an internal review into their charging of more than 250 capital right defendants with obstructing an official proceeding of Congress. That was, if you recall, the charge that was dropped by the Supreme Court. These aren't pardons now. This was the Supreme Court about, was it 3 months ago, 4 months ago? Maybe more. Actually, more like 6 months ago. 6 months ago, yeah. The Supreme Court said, no, those charges don't hold up. And they either let people go if that was their only charge, or they had those people's sentences reduced if that was part of a combined set of charges. The obstructing an official proceeding one, they said they should never have been charged that. So Edward R. Martin says, obviously the use was a great failure of our office and we need to get to the bottom of it. Now, I should say that's a little bit unfair because a lot of judges signed off on those charges and then a lot of jury found people guilty of those charges. So it's not like it was unreasonable. It's kind of hindsight saying, they should never have done that after the Supreme Court ruled in a way that many people didn't expect them to. So you go, okay, so what's the story with this Edward R. Martin guy? Why is he being unfair like that? Turns out he's a Stop the Steal organizer after Trump's 2020 election loss. Turns out he was the board member of a non-profit group that raised money for January 6 defendants that regard them as victims of political persecution. Turns out he was a defense attorney for 3 defendants, including a Proud Boys leader who pled guilty to assaulting police with an axe handle. Turns out that's our Edward R. Martin Jr. So he is running an investigation into the prosecutors of the J6s. Get ready for a bit more of that over the next 4 years. Next memorandum. This is the Stopping federal hiring, the hiring freeze memorandum. We're now into the staffing section. Hiring freeze from January 20 doesn't apply to military personnel or, of the armed forces or to positions related to immigration enforcement or national security or public safety. Also, the freeze can't adversely impact the provision of Social Security, Medicare or veterans benefits. And the director of the Office of Personnel Management, remember them, OPM? We talked a bit about them in PEP194. The director of OPM could grant exemptions from this freeze where those exemptions are otherwise necessary. Within 90 days, the OMB director should submit a plan to reduce the size of the federal government's workforce through efficiency improvements and attrition. And they're supposed to use the assistance of DOGE for that, which is interesting. You'll see why that's interesting coming up. And that after that is when the hiring freeze can end, except for the IRS, where the hiring freeze is indefinite. Few thoughts. The federal workforce has been basically the same size for decades. It's been pretty much the same size for 50 years. No matter how much the federal workforce has grown, the work of the federal workforce has grown. No matter how much the work of the work they have had to do has grown. No matter how much the budget has grown, the numbers of workers has stayed the same. If you want to save money, don't get rid of some of these extra efficient federal workers. Get rid of some of the private contractors who they have increased over time and they are more expensive than the federal workforce. No one ever notices them. They always fixate on the full-time workers and not the contractors, even though the contractors cost more. Also, I hate the way Republicans think. If you treat the IRS like shit and you just have indefinite hiring freezes, it will somehow help. I think we have now seen from the Inflation Reduction Act from Joe Biden, which increased the funding of the IRS and had all these bold predictions of how much money they were going to raise because they had more staff now. Increasing the IRS is not some magic bullet for revenue. I'm sorry. I was expecting it to raise lots of money too, and it just didn't. Okay, let's just concede. The increased funding for IRS did increase revenue, but not nearly as much as was projected. It was a small amount. Maybe it's because people just use their tax lawyers to find new loopholes. Maybe it's because it's really hard to prosecute tax offences and it costs a lot of money. I'm not speculating why. I'm just saying it's a fact that more workers doesn't mean huge sort of rivers of gold. It means slightly more revenue. But if you starve the IRS, well, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? That's not going to help much because the only people going to prosper from that are tax cheats. I guess I know why Trump wants to starve them then, but yeah, that's not helping. I think Republicans think of it like a tax cut. They think, well, if there's no one to enforce it, then you can pay less taxes, maybe. But I mean, what are they talking about? It's implicitly suggesting that tax evasion is a good thing. Maybe that's what they're trying to imply. Look, I don't have a massive problem with the hiring freeze. Forget the IRS for a second. The general hiring freeze for 90 days or whatever it is, I don't have a huge problem with that. You've got to try to find more efficiency in your government somehow, and the executive has control over a number of those positions. So having a hiring freeze, I think that's a good thing for a short period of time. I'll just note, though, that this is the same plan that Trump went through in his first term. It didn't work very well. In fact, after a few months, the White House was denying that they even tried to cut jobs. Many of the agencies didn't even submit a plan on how jobs could be cut. They didn't even bother. So it didn't work so well the first time. Let's see this time around. And also, by the way, if you're trying to make government more efficient, if you have a situation where you stop them hiring or you try to just get lots of people to quit, which is what they're trying to do in other instances, which we've talked about already, and I'll talk more about again. That's not the best way to do it. Doing what they're doing right here, of reviewing properly and then come out with some systemic way to try and make the government more efficient. That is the way you should do it. So I'll give him props for this one. This is reasonable as far as I'm concerned. I'll also note there was another OPM memo that was put out that said the cap on Schedule C, which is political appointees, has been removed for 240 days. So there's no limits on non-Senate confirmed political appointees for 240 days. So that sucks a bit. If you're saying we're not hiring any more independent workers who are non-political, but we can hire as many political appointees as we like in the meantime, that's gonna speed up the hackification of the bureaucracy, which we'll see more. Next one, making it easier to fire civil servants. This is another staffing executive order. Obviously, you might recall we talked about Schedule F. Schedule F is back. That was the 2020 order that Trump signed, which makes it easier to hire and fire civil servants, except for now he's changed the name to policy/career. Now, the theory behind this makes sense, to be honest. The theory is that you get some hopeless public servants out there and they're impossible to fire. You know what? I understand about that. I work at the ABC. I know that they're not the majority, but there are some people that you just go, how has this person kept their job for 25 years? They're just pathetic. And the answer is they're too expensive to sack. It's just too hard. The process you got to go through is very exacting, and the amount you got to pay them out is huge. Now, I should say at the ABC it's less of a problem because they used to be, because they went to a different system about like the year before I came here, so I'm effectively a contractor. But they went to a different system where there are a lot less protections. So I don't want to give you the wrong idea about the ABC, but my point is I've definitely seen those kinds of public servants before. And the theory is you should be able to get rid of them. You should be able to sack them. If you've got a bad worker, you should be able to sack them. I get it. That's fine. And then look, there were some stats in the executive order that back this up. Only 41% of civil service supervisors are confident that they can remove an employee who engaged in insubordination or serious misconduct. 26% of civil service supervisors are confident that they can remove an employee for poor performance. So a quarter say if they're shit workers, they can sack them. And only 41% say serious misconduct will be enough for them to sack these workers. I just laughed then because I've got my timer on my phone. And when I said serious misconduct, you know who on the Apple phone lit up. I don't want to say her name. But, anyway, look, I'm sure those stats are correct, but let's be real here. This is not about what they're saying. This is not about sacking poor workers. Well, I'm sure it's partly about that, but what's mostly about is Trump getting his loyal civil service he goes on about endlessly. He loves talking about loyal workers. He thinks they should be loyal to them. He basically wants the federal workforce to be full of yes men. And that worries me a lot. Okay, so that's my concern. If he was just trying to make the federal workforce more responsive, I'd understand that. But yeah, I lack faith in this respect. Having said that, the executive order doesn't say that. This is what the executive order says. It says employees in or applicants for schedule policy/career positions, that's Schedule F, are not required to personally or politically support the current president or the policies of the current administration. They are required to faithfully implement administration policies to the best of their ability, consistent with their constitutional oath and the vesting of executive authority solely in the president. Failure to do so is grounds for dismissal. I hope they're telling the truth. If Trump just wants a responsive workforce, great. Sack the turkeys, no problems. But if he's about purging about 50,000 workers and replacing them with cronies, that would not be good. Let's find out. I should say that Biden tried to stop this from happening. He did see this coming because Schedule F was back in 2020. He tried to Trump-proof these workers, so he passed regulations that would allow these workers to still retain their civil service protections. And remember, regulations beat executive orders. He set up an appeals process before the Merit Systems Protection Board for exactly this kind of outcome. It remains to be seen if his plans will work or not. I don't know. Maybe he did Trump-proof it. Maybe there's about to be a whole bunch of court cases. Maybe this ain't going to work. Or maybe he did his best and he's going to fail. Even if it does work, Trump can pass his own regulations over the next year or so to repeal Biden's mischief. It'll just take him 12 months to 24 months to do so. Next staffing executive order, making it easy to fire senior civil servants. This is really quick. It's basically a call for more accountability from senior executive service officials. They're the guys who are just below the presidential appointees, so they're basically the top jobs in the civil service. But there isn't much in this executive order. He just wants to see plans for how they can be easier to fire. Okay? Send the man plans. Also, in this order, he says they're going to hire panels of the senior executive service officials will be hired by panels of political appointees, not civil servants. They're currently hired by civil servants. So that means more politicization. There's a lot of common ground with a lot of these executive orders. They're pushing towards more politicization, which is sad. I guess Trump would call this responsiveness, though. That's what he tends to call politicization. Unless it's politicization by Joe Biden, and he calls it weaponisation. Next executive order, reforming the federal hiring process. All right, now let me tell you a sad tale about staffing. Lockie, can you give us some sad music, please? Thank you. Current federal hiring practices are broken, insular, and outdated. They no longer focus on merit, practical skill, and dedication to our Constitution. Federal hiring should not be based on impermissible factors, such as one's commitment to a legal racial discrimination under the guise of equity, or one's commitment to the invented concept of gender identity over sex. Inserting such factors into the hiring process subverts the will of the people, puts critical government functions at risk, and risks losing the best qualified candidates. Okay, thanks, Lockie. This order calls for a federal hiring plan. It's extremely vague, just lots of shit like you just heard, without the music. But one thing is crystal clear. The intention is to prevent the hiring of individuals based on their race, sex, or religion. They definitely don't want that anymore. And you definitely can't consider equity either. For those who don't remember what equity means, equality is when you treat everyone the same. Equity is when you treat people differently, so everyone ends up in the same place. Equality would be putting everyone in a race at the same start line. Equity would be staggering the start line, so the fastest people start from further back and the slower people start further up, and so they all end up at the finish line at the same time. That's equity versus equality. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of equity either. I'm an equality guy. That's what I believe in, but yeah, different people believe different things. Conservatives would say that equity is discriminating against the harder and better workers to handicap them. Progressives would say you're helping the disadvantaged overcome systemic prejudice. And if that systemic prejudice wasn't there, you could have equality. But it is there, and it's unfair. So let's make the playing field even. That's what the progressives would say. Either way, you can't do it anymore when you're hiring public servants. You can't do equity anymore, at least according to this executive order. It also says that the hires must be, quote, committed to improving the efficiency of the federal government, passionate about the ideals of our American Republic, and committed to upholding the rule of law and the United States Constitution. Whatever that means. I have no idea what that means, but that's what hires have got to be. All right, that's that one. Next staffing executive order, ending discrimination. Now this is the executive order that I previewed with Dr. Dave back in PEP194 when he was kind of flip-flopping all over the place. Not flip-flopping, but he was flipping around all over the place, getting out of order. He was making me tighten up. I was getting very tense. We were just skipping around all over the place, and he started talking about Lyndon Johnson's 1965 Executive Order 11246. And remember I said, I want to talk about that in PEEP. Well, now we're going to talk about it. It's because of this executive order. Executive Order 111246 from 1965 prohibited federal contractors who do over $10,000 in government business, that's $1965, from discriminating in employment decisions on the basis of race, colour, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. When the sexual orientation and gender identity parts obviously didn't come from Lyndon Johnson, they were added in 2014 by Obama, which means, sorry, I'm correcting myself already. This must be the latest version of that order, which means $10,000 is in today's money, not 965 money. So that's not much. That's basically all government contractors. Can't discriminate in employment decisions on the basis of race, colour, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. The new executive order says the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs within the Department of Labour shall immediately cease promoting diversity, holding federal contractors and subcontractors responsible for taking affirmative action, and allowing all or encouraging federal contractors and subcontractors to engage in workforce balancing based on race, colour, sex, sexual preference, religion, or national origin. Contractors have 90 days until they have to comply. So note that the Department of Labour has to stop promoting diversity, but that doesn't mean that the companies, the contractors, can't be promoting diversity. The Department of Labour has to stop holding federal contractors and subcontractors responsible for taking affirmative action, but they can do it off their own bat. And it can't, but the Department of Labour must stop allowing federal contractors and subcontractors to engage in workforce balancing. Allowing. So what does allowing mean? Does it mean that now there should be rules and regulations that ban federal contractors and subcontractors from trying to balance out their workforce racially, sexually, sexual preference, religiously? That's new ground. But let's talk a little bit about affirmative action, because like I said on PEP194, affirmative action is not what you think it is. Oh, sorry, before we do, I should mention one more thing. Note that all of this is only talking about federal contractors, not all businesses, okay? None of this is having an effect on businesses that don't contract with the government. But many big companies are federal contractors, so it's still a lot of businesses. And these kinds of regimes do tend to filter through the wider business community because there's so many federal contractors out there, it tends to set a standard. Also, this order includes most universities as well because they tend to receive grants from the federal government that are included by this executive order. So look, this probably will filter through all businesses. Certainly history suggests that the Lyndon Johnson order was a powerful force in fighting discrimination back in the day. So maybe this might do the opposite. So this executive order makes each contractor agree there's compliance with non-discrimination law determines whether they're going to get paid. They have to agree that they realise their compliance with not discriminating against people determines whether they're going to get paid. That's a very powerful incentive. In fact, they have to certify to the government that they don't operate any programs promoting DEI that violate any applicable federal anti-discrimination laws. They need to sign a form certifying it. Having said that, that may do nothing, because I presume the companies who are into affirmative action and are into balancing race, etc., probably believe that their DEI policies do not violate federal anti-discrimination laws. They probably think it's important to stop discrimination, actually. So that's a handy legal loophole. They can genuinely sign that form and say, our programs don't contradict any anti-discrimination law, even though the Trump administration probably disagree with them. But anyway, but yeah, so let's talk about this affirmative action now. Affirmative action, which was just banned for contractors, has nothing to do with quotas of, say, black people that you have to hire. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs defines its affirmative action obligations today as the obligation, well, up to this executive order, the obligation on the part of the contractor to take action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, colour, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, disability, or status as a protected veteran. So it actually defines affirmative action as fighting discrimination, not helping to practice reverse discrimination. This definition that conservatives have given affirmative action, and not just conservatives, lots of people, of being quotas and not picking white people on purpose, not allowing white people to even apply for a job because they're trying to stack the job with black people. All those kinds of definitions are not what the actual definition of affirmative action is at all. Like, if anything, some of those actions contradict the definition of affirmative action. So it's strange that what Trump's just done is to try to end legally the definition of affirmative action, which is kind of standing for what he says he wants it to stand for. Do you know the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs doesn't even permit quotas, preferences, or set-asides? No, they're not even allowed. I didn't know that. I just found out all this when I was doing research for this executive order. I was amazed. What the old system did do, though, it didn't push quotas, but what Lyndon Johnson's executive order did was it forced you to put in an effort. Contractors with at least 50 employees had to develop and maintain written affirmative action programs. I mean, with the real definition of affirmative action, anti-discrimination programs. Trump also, by the way, revoked Obama's Executive Order 13672, which prohibited federal contractors from discriminating against employees on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity as well. Once again, no quotas, banning discrimination, which is what Trump says he's trying to do with this executive order. So the Lyndon Johnson executive order it made you come up with a plan that, number one, just think about it, which is going to help. And number two, that's a plan that the government can hold you to if they know your numbers aren't real flash. If you've got a plan to fight discrimination and you have literally 0 black people out of 20,000 employees, then that gives the government some ammunition to try and lean on you, because they're only going to pay you if you don't discriminate. That's one of the terms of your contract, right? The question is, though, how do they find out that you've got 0 out of 20,000 employees? This is what made 11246 really special. It provided the mechanisms that helped enforce the Civil Rights Act. It not only required companies to declare they don't discriminate against members of protected groups, it also made part of their contracts the gathering of data and the sharing of data with the government, information about representation in their companies. That data is the important bit. That's how you find out the 0 out of 20,000. You got nowhere to hide. So finally, under 11246, contractors had to show that they had a plan for reaching out to protected groups, and you could see if the plan was working. That is very, very powerful if you're fighting discrimination. So losing 11246 is really going to weaken the spirit of non-discrimination law. And that's also, by the way, the answer to the question, which I was asking Dave, which was, discrimination is illegal, isn't it? Who cares about 11246? Discrimination is illegal. You don't need anything else. There's a law already. Why do you need a double law? Title 7 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act it says it shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. Also, there's the Bostock case from the Supreme Court. They found 6-3 that both sexual orientation and gender identity are protected under Title 7 because they would be a form of sex-based discrimination. So the reason why they don't count without EO 11246 is because 11246 provided the data that you could see whether people were satisfying those legislation or not. Finally, this order has a snitches clause as well. I hate these snitches clauses. Under this executive order, every federal agency must recommend to the Attorney General up to 9 potential investigations of corporations, large non-profits, foundations with assets of $500 million or more, higher education assistance with endowments of $1 billion or more, or bar and medical associations. So they have to, every agency must recommend up to 9 potential investigations of people who are doing DEI, I guess. Now, they will say that this will encourage the private sector to end illegal discrimination and preferences, including DEI. I say that's enforced snitching, and I hate it. I think it sucks. Next memorandum, the memorandum ending remote work. We also referred at one point in time to this in PEP 194. I will go into more detail now. This memorandum orders federal agencies in the executive branch to terminate all remote work arrangements for their workers. So that doesn't mean some hybrid situation. They've got to be back to the office full time. Now, I must admit, I don't automatically have a lot of sympathy for government workers who complain about not being able to work from home. I must confess. But to be fair, a number of these people only took the job because it was a work from home job. Some of them took the job and they live in a different city because it's a work from home job. Some of them are in 2-earner households with children, and it helps them be a full-time worker while juggling school schedules. In fact, to be honest, one could argue that working from home might be the magic bullet to finally make inroads into the gender pay gap. Working from home provides enough flexibility for genuine equality, that mind you, not equity, between two people when one of them has more socially enforced domestic chores, usually a woman, than the other one does, usually a man. If you've got a situation where they're supposed to work 8 hours a day or they're supposed to do a certain amount of work, but it can be from home, and those hours can be flexible, then it doesn't matter if you've got these chores. You are facing identical conditions. And so you don't have a situation where the person who has the chores, the person who has the domestic chores is disadvantaged and ends up getting paid less. It's like how in labour economics, pharmacists have a notoriously low gender pay gap, even between middle-aged mothers and men without children. And usually that's the biggest gap. The biggest gap is usually 50-year-old women who had kids and 50-year-old men who didn't have kids. That's usually a massive gap. Why? Why is there such a small gender pay gap for pharmacists? It's because most pharmacists just work when they like. Each pharmacy will have several pharmacists, and one pharmacist might elect to show up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, say, and then they get paid for that 2 days' work. Great. Good times. Maximum flexibility for the pharmacist. Working from home gives all workers maximum flexibility. It's not about bludgeoning. You might work longer hours at home. Trust me, I work longer hours when I'm working at home. I work long hours all the time, but yeah, when I'm at home, I just don't stop. I'm reading on the toilet. I probably shouldn't tell you that. But that's an image for you. The point is, working from home offers more flexibility, and now it's gone, at the federal level at least. Why is it gone? Well, some people have made very clear this is about driving federal workers to quit. I assume these people think the people working from home who would quit are the lazy workers. They're the laziest workers, and that's why they quit. Not because they live in a different city, not because they might be balancing 22 hours of work a day between their job and chores and this, that, and the other. No, they're just lazy. That's what they probably think, I assume. Well, look, last year, Musk and Ramaswamy wrote an op-ed about DOGE, and they openly admitted, quote, it would result in a wave, this is getting people back from home, it would result in a wave of voluntary terminations that we welcome, which leads us to that fork in the road email from OPM that Dave told you about in PEP194. I'll read it to you, at least the relevant bit. If you choose not to continue in your current role in the federal workforce, we thank you for your service to your country, and you'll be provided with a dignified, fair departure from the federal government utilising a deferred resignation program. If you resign under this program, you'll retain all pay and benefits regardless of your daily workload and will be exempted from all applicable in-person work requirements until September 30, 2025, or earlier if you choose to accelerate your resignation for any reason. Note, this didn't apply to postal workers, members of the military, immigration officials, and certain national security roles. Now that might sound tempting. You at least get to stay at home for the next 8 months if you retire at or before September 30, 2025. But it gets even more tempting when the FAQ that I told Dave about was released soon afterwards. The question in the FAQ was, am I expected to work during the deferred resignation period? And the answer was no. Except in rare cases determined by your agency, you are not expected to work. Now that's tempting, 8 months off with full pay, if it's real. There's a lot of reasons this might be too good to be true. Firstly, legal questions. There's normally a 10-day cap on employee administrative leave. Dave mentioned this. So how are they supposedly paying your administrative leave for 8 months? Also, Dave didn't mention these ones. There is no authorised funding for federal agencies right now past March. Also, federal law caps voluntary resignation payments at $25,000, which is a lot less than 8 months' pay for pretty much any federal worker. So the entire scheme may be illegal. All of those problems can be fixed by Congress, of course. But what if Congress doesn't fix them? What happens then? Some of the wording is a little tricky as well. The OPM memo says employees who take the offer should promptly have their duties reassigned or eliminated and be placed on paid administrative leave. Wonderful. Except what does promptly mean? Should promptly have their duties reassigned. 8 months maybe? I don't know. Furthermore, the memo said that the employee won't be placed on administrative leave if, quote, the agency head determines that it's necessary for the employee to be actively engaged in transitioning job duties. That seems worth noting, doesn't it? You might say, well, why do you assume that they're vital? Maybe they're not vital at all. Maybe they're not. But what if Elon Musk and his buddies are underestimating the value of the federal workforce? You don't think he could? He already did something very much like that when he pulled this stunt with Twitter. Remember Dave said he did the fork in the road thing with Twitter? Well, back then he said, after he sacked a bunch of people who quit, who took the redundancy package, there's no question that some of the people who were let go probably shouldn't have been let go. And then he tried to hire some of them back. He stuffed up. He couldn't get them back that time. This time round, the government can screw these people over because they're around for 8 months to screw around with. So maybe the agency head will determine that it's necessary for the employee to be actively engaged in their previous job duties. I'm sorry, no working from home and no time off. I don't know. Democrats certainly don't trust the offer. This is Democrat Senator Tim Kaine.
And they received an email that said, from the administration, if you tender your resignation by next Friday, we will guarantee you payment through the end of September, whether or not you show up for work. So tender your resignation, and then, boy, it's just going to be a gravy train. You're just going to get paid for 7 months without working. The president has no authority to make that offer. There's no budget line item to pay people who are not showing up for work. This is a guy who made this promise to contractors again and again and again when he was a private business guy. Oh, come work for me on my casino. Come work for me in a hotel. We're going to do a handshake. We're going to do a contract. The contractor does the work and then finds out they get stiffed. So my message to federal employees who receive this is, yeah, the president has tried to terrorize you for about a week and then gives you a little sweetheart offer. If you resign in the next week, we're just going to pay you for doing nothing for the next 7 months. Don't be fooled. He's tricked hundreds of people with that offer. If you accept that offer and resign, he'll stiff you just like he stiffed the contractors. He doesn't have any authority to do this.
I can't believe I said Democrat Senator. It should be Democratic Senator. Democrat Senator is what Fox News people say when they want to piss off Democrats. The adjective is democratic. There's a few things that Tim Kaine got wrong there. Either way. Number one, I believe according to the law, a federal worker can unresign if they do it before they leave. So if the government stiffs you when you stay home, you can potentially just take it back. That might not be right, though. I might be wrong on that one. Number two, this is not from Trump, no matter what Democratic Senator Tim Kaine said. Remember, I've just been assuming it's from Elon Musk because Elon Musk did exactly the same thing with the same name at Twitter. It's pure Elon Musk. Also, the offer came from OPM, who, as I told Dave in PEP194, are run by Elon lackeys. I did actually get something wrong, though. I need to correct myself from PEP194. It's not just one youngster leading. There are two youngsters leading OPM. That's the Office of Personnel Management. That Wired won't name either of them. One is a 21-year-old who worked at Peter Thiel's Palantir firm. The other is a 2024 high school graduate so they graduated in 2024 and their resume consists of a summer job at Musk's Neuralink company, as well as previous experience as a camp counselor and a bike mechanic. Apparently, they were set to start college last fall, but now they are one of the people right at the top at the Office of Personnel Management. And they're doing loads of wild shit. Anyway, a senior administration official also openly told the NBC that they believe 5 to 10% of the federal workforce will quit and it will save them about $100 billion. But it's not going to. Why? Because the workforce they'll be left with, if 5 to 10% quit, are going to be less productive. This is what I was telling you before. There's no planning involved. This is haphazard. If you just annoy people into quitting or just randomly offer for like these gold handshake offers for people to take, people are going to be leaving from the wrong jobs. Think about who's most likely to leave. People with other options, people who can get another job. The young, the talented, people in demand. They're the ones most likely to leave. The people most likely to stay are the time servers who are useless. The people that Trump is sad that he can't sack. This is a strategy for reducing the productivity of your workforce. That's probably enough on that one. All right, now we're getting to some that have gotten a lot of news. Well, we've already just covered a few. Here's another one. Defending women. This is the anti-trans order. That's they call it defense of women. I can understand, to be fair, I can understand how some issues, when it involves transgender people, could be construed as a battle of rights between trans women and cis women. Like, for instance, we talked about one in PEP last year, competitive sport, where the participation of trans women in competitive sport will maybe affect the cis women who are competing against the trans women. Maybe it won't, maybe it will, but if it does, then their rights are at loggerheads with each other. So that's an example where there's a battle of rights. But then there are other contexts where there's no battle of rights at all. There's just rights. Like, for example, what gender you choose to put on your passport. That doesn't affect anyone but you. Not allowing people to list the gender they identify with, especially not allowing non-binary people to put an X. That can't be construed in any way other than showing your animus, as far as I'm concerned. Like to stop people putting an X on a passport. Who cares? Also, this entire framing of trans women versus cis women that this executive order is undertaking, it completely ignores the existence of trans men, even though trans men are just as affected by all these changes involving trans people. They're just as affected as trans women are, and yet no one seems to even acknowledge they exist in this executive order. Sadly, that's something I think trans men are getting used to. Okay, but what does it say? The executive order says, well, look, his logic is underpinned by this idea. Efforts to eradicate the biological reality of sex fundamentally attack women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, and well-being. The erasure of sex in language and policy has a corrosive impact not just on women, but on the validity of the entire American system. Now, what I find interesting about that quote there is they're responding to what they say is the erasure of sex by trying to erase gender instead. That's what they're trying to do. Now, my personal view is that both sex and gender are important. And I also happen to think that the public narrative when it comes to transgender issues frequently confuses and conflates the two. It confuses sex and gender. Like, people use them interchangeably a lot. And the way forward, in my view, is to have a strong sense of both sex and gender. But that's not the way Trump has chosen. He's looking to basically outlaw at the federal government level anything to do with gender and just prioritize sex. So these are the changes. They define sex. It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. It defines this executive order defines female as a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. And it defines male as a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. This actually commits the same offence that they often accuse gender activists of committing, of creating circular definitions. You might have seen some Matt Walsh viral clip online or something where he's asking some gender activist or academic to define a woman. What is a woman? And they say something to the effect of, a woman is someone who says they're a woman. And he goes, well, hang on, you can't just say a woman is a woman. That's circular. They're doing the same thing here, and I'll tell you why. There has been some focus online that at conception, neither sex produces reproductive cells, that begins after 6 weeks of gestation. But if you look carefully at their definition of male is belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. Not at conception they produce the small reproductive cell. In other words, they're saying a male is someone who at conception belongs to the sex that will eventually be male. As in, a male is someone who's a male. And so this is a circular definition as well. Obviously, as well, on top of that, this definition pretends that intersex people don't exist at all. Interestingly, as well, the EO does say each agency should give the terms sex, male, female, men, women, boys and girls the meanings set forth in Section 2 of this order when interpreting or applying statutes, regulations or guidance and in all other official agency business documents and communications. So what's going on there is Trump is setting the definition for everyone. He's not allowing science or biology experts to set the definition of male and female, despite all the complaining and gasbagging for years that gender activists hijacked these definitions from scientists and biology experts. Instead, he's chosen to arrogate the power to define these concepts by himself. And these definitions are going to be applied by all government agencies and bodies and actions. That might actually justify, through Title IX funding, Trump's bans of transgender women playing women's sport in schools and colleges. Remember he was talking about doing that. Well, if all government regulations have to make those assumptions of sex, that will stop transgender women from being allowed to play in cisgender women's in sport with cisgender women. I should also say, polling suggests that move would be extremely popular. The New York Times found 79% of Americans believe transgender women should not be permitted to play women's sports. That includes 67% of Democrats. There are also a bunch of bureaucracy changes as well. Passports and government personnel records must reflect Trump's definitions of male and female. And there are no other options. Male, female, that's it. Agency forms, quote, that requiring individual sex shall list male or female and shall not request gender identity. They aren't even allowed to promote gender ideology. They can't even promote it. So government workers, for instance, listing their pronouns, that's against government rules now. There's since been some suggestion that your current passport will remain valid if you've got an X there, but the new rules will apply from when you get your next passport. We'll see if that's true. When states have passed these kinds of changes in the past, some people got their driver's license confiscated almost immediately. So we'll see about that. There are some practical changes in this executive order as well. Agencies shall ensure that males are not detained in women's prisons or housed in women's detention centres. It also ensures that intimate spaces designated for women, girls or females, or for men, boys or males, are designated by sex and not identity. So that's going to mean locker rooms, bathrooms in schools and unis need to be only cisgendered, whatever you're, like no transgender people going to the locker room or bathroom of their choice. Because those are controlled by Title IX regulations, which are federal. Also says agencies shall ensure that no federal funds are expended for any medical procedure, treatment, or drug for the purpose of conforming an inmate's appearance to that of the opposite sex. Prison guidelines there. My key interview is about this very topic. I talk to Dr. Alix McLearin, the woman who created the guidelines for dealing with transgender prisoners over the last decade. But if you don't watch the interview, let me just tell you the key stats. Out of 140,000 people in federal government jails, about 2,000 of them are transgender. 2,000 out of 140,000. Out of the 1,300 transgender women in federal prison, only about 10 of them were housed in female prisons in 2023. 10 out of 1,300 were transferred. Out of the 700 transgender men, our interviewee could only remember housing one transgender man in men's prison. 1 out of 700. And she also said the process to decide to transfer a trans inmate takes at least a year. They're not messing around there, okay? It's a strenuous process. And out of all of these transgender prisoners, the total cost of gender-affirming hormone therapy was $153,000 in 2022. Not exactly affecting a lot of people, but this executive order bans it. My favourite bit of this executive order, I'm leaving till last, which is their civil rights protections. There are civil rights protections in this bill. You might go, oh, well, that's good to know. They're outlawing all this stuff involving transgender people, but they're looking after their civil rights protections at least. Let me read out for you, shall I? Section 5, protecting rights. The Attorney General shall issue guidance to ensure the freedom to express the binary nature of sex and the right to single-sex spaces in workplaces and federally funded entities covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is Orwellian. They are protecting your civil rights to agree with them, but they're doing nothing to protect people who disagree with them. What kind of rights are those? Far from that, actually. They say they shall prioritise investigations and litigation to enforce the rights and freedoms identified. As in, they're going to prioritise investigations to help people who agree with them over other investigations. Maybe over investigations helping people who disagree with them. That there is what you call a violation of the First Amendment. By the way, the very opposite. This is the very opposite of the spirit of the Civil Rights Act, which they are quoting there, which was, the Civil Rights Act was about protecting minorities from the majority, not the other way around. At the end of the day, though, almost nothing in this executive order, while frustrating, is an immediate, direct change. There are some, but it's not as much as you think. What this is doing is directing agencies to do things. So every single realistic change there is going to require new rulemaking from the agency. Rulemaking doesn't happen overnight. Rulemaking has to go through a process. It has to allow comments. It has to jump through hoops. This is going to take time, maybe years, and it's going to be challenged in the courts, especially the Supreme Court, which has, in the Bostock case, shown a very different view about transgender rights than this executive order does. So this is going to be a slog. Incidentally, in the New York Times poll I mentioned before, 49% of Americans said that society has gone too far in accommodating transgender people. So this is a 50-50 issue. It's going to be a slog. A slog very much like reading for an hour and a half straight the notes that you made at length about all these executive orders. I reckon I'm going to go another 35 minutes. Let's see what we're up to then. I'm not going to finish. All right, next is the prices memo. This is called Delivering Emergency Price Relief for American Families and Defeating the Cost of Living Crisis. Woo! This is a good one. This sounds like a big deal, doesn't it? This is what the election was about, wasn't it? About defeating the cost of living crisis. What's the answer? I can't wait to find out. Shall we read it together? I hereby order the heads of all executive departments and agencies to deliver emergency price relief consistent with applicable law to the American people and increase the prosperity of the American worker. Whoa! Why didn't anyone think before about just asking the government agencies to just fix the price issues? That's a great idea. Well done. That should do the trick. But wait, if you think that's meaningless waffle, there is a safety net locked in that's going to make sure that the cost of living crisis is indeed defeated. Quote, within 30 days of the date of this memorandum, the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy shall report to me, and every 30 days thereafter, on the status of the implementation of this memorandum. Wow. Every 30 days, someone is going to explain to Trump that no one's come up with a way to defeat the cost of living crisis and to deliver emergency price relief. How about that? Eureka! Crisis solved. That is that entire executive order. Let's move on. The trade memo. Now, this starts off badly by focusing the entire executive order on Trump's obsession with the trade deficit. I'll read it to you. The order asks the Treasury Secretary to, quote, investigate the causes of our country's large and persistent annual trade deficit in goods, as well as the economic and national security implications and risks resulting from such deficits, and recommend appropriate measures such as a global supplemental tariff or other policies to remedy such deficits. Now, most economists couldn't give a toss about the trade deficit, and no one thinks that the best way to remedy the trade deficit is with a global tariff. That is the way to make a country poor. But look, bottom line is that's just an investigation. He's not saying for anything to happen. He just wants an investigation into that. And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, he's a serious economist. He is. So look, I'm sure he'll report back in a way that isn't embarrassing. There's also more investigations mentioned, though. This is where I think the memo picks up a bit. Sorry, the executive order picks up a bit. Treasury Secretary shall investigate the feasibility of establishing and recommending the best methods for designing, building, and implementing an external revenue service to collect tariffs, duties, and other foreign trade-related revenues. And the US Trade Representative shall undertake a review of and identify any unfair trade practices by other countries and recommend appropriate actions to remedy such practices. And the Trade Rep shall also review existing United States trade agreements and sectoral trade agreements and recommend any revisions that may be necessary. It goes on. There's a few more of these. It seeks a series of reviews about the trade situation and what's best to be done about it. Now, I've said before, I think creating an external revenue service is kind of stupid. I mean, we're just talking about what customs does at the moment, which is impose tariffs. It's just branding. But that was just one of the inquiries, and there's a whole bunch of them. The thing I like is that even though it's clear that Trump has prejudged this issue generally, he loves his tariffs, he hasn't prejudged the specifics. He's asking for specifics from people whose job it is to come up with specifics. He's getting his appointees to conduct proper reviews before he does anything stupid. That's good governing as far as I'm concerned, even though I am completely on the other side of this argument from Trump on all these tariff issues. You know I hate tariffs. Look, I mean, he's doing what he should do. He's asking for advice, and then he'll act on that advice, presumably, hopefully. Yeah, good on you, mate. Tick. It's a good process. There's a memorandum limiting new regulations. That's very quick. Trump ordered all executive departments and agencies not to propose any rule or directive until a department head reviews and approves the rule. For rules that have been published, maybe pause them for 60 days, they ask, before they come into effect, so those rules can be reevaluated or the government can solicit comments about those rules. This isn't mandatory, just advised, whatever. Look, I think being circumspect until the administration finds its feet, that seems reasonable. I'm okay with that. Now we've got ending the weaponisation of the government, that executive order. This is basically a call for an investigation. First, let me read you the general statement. It's the policy of the United States to identify and take appropriate action to correct past misconduct by the federal government related to the weaponization of law enforcement and the weaponization of the intelligence community. Okay, one of the things I like about this is that it's open-ended. I think it would be a good thing to hold reviews into the past weaponization of the government. They're just saying the weaponization. They're not saying anything about what weaponization. They're saying an investigation into weaponization from the past. That's good. A lot of presidents might have done some weaponizing in the past. Sadly, I'm wrong about that because that is clearly just sloppy drafting that they forgot to mention Biden, because in the other part of the executive order, they definitely do. Let's look at the actual actions that they make very clear who this is meant to be targeting. The Attorney General shall review the activities of all departments and agencies exercising civil or criminal enforcement authority of the United States, including but not limited to the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission over the last 4 years. That's pretty clear. And identify any instances where a department's or agency's conduct appears to have been contrary to the purposes and policies of this order, and prepare a report to be submitted to the President with recommendations for appropriate remedial actions. Also, they've got exactly the same thing, but for the Director of National Intelligence. The Director of National Intelligence shall review the activities of the intelligence community over the last 4 years and identify any instances where the intelligence community's conduct appears to have been contrary to the purposes and policies of the order, and prepare a report to be submitted to the President with recommendations for appropriate remedial actions. So this is actually, sadly, a Get Biden inquiry. Having said that, let's see what they come up with. I guess the virtue of the order depends on the quality of the reviews. If they're good reviews with good recommendations, then who cares what they want? Who cares if this is meant to be a Get Biden inquiry? If what it gets is reasonable and it's a high quality review with high quality recommendations that aren't hack-worthy, then fine. So, do you trust Pam Bondi? Do you trust Tulsi Gabbard or whoever ends up being Director of National Intelligence? I leave it to your judgment. Your answer to those questions determines what you think of this particular executive order, I believe. And there's another one like this, the Restoring Freedom of Speech Amendment. Executive order. There are 2 sections to this executive order. First, there's the No Shit Sherlock part. No Shit Sherlock part goes like this. They declare it is their policy to ensure that no federal government officer, employee, or agent engages in or facilitates any conduct that would unconstitutionally abridge the free speech of any American citizen. And no taxpayer resources are used to engage in or facilitate any conduct that would unconstitutionally abridge the free speech of any American citizen. What? They're trying to say that you shouldn't undertake unconstitutionally abridging the free speech of us. It's unconstitutional. You don't need an executive order, a piss-weak executive order, to say that the federal government will not break the Constitution. That's why we have courts. They will take care of that. So that's the no shit Sherlock part. But then there's the investigation part. It is the policy of the United States to, quote, identify and take appropriate action to correct past misconduct by the federal government related to censorship of protected speech. The Attorney General shall investigate the activities of the federal government over the last 4 years that are inconsistent with the purposes and policies of this order and prepare a report to be submitted to the President with recommendations for appropriate remedial actions. There's one problem. Once again, I've got no problems with the idea of a free speech inquiry. Free speech is important. This is potentially a valuable use of the Attorney General's resources, but the inquiry does seem to be slightly prejudged, just slightly, when this is how the executive order begins. Over the last 4 years, the previous administration trampled free speech rights by censoring American speech on online platforms, often by exerting substantial coercive pressure on third parties, such as social media companies, to moderate, deplatform, or otherwise suppress speech that the federal government did not approve. Under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, the federal government infringed on the constitutionally protected speech rights of American citizens across the United States in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. I know there will be some conservatives listening to this who go, yeah, they did. But you know what? The Supreme Court heard a case about this exact topic, and they disagree with that statement. They did not find that the federal government infringed on constitutionally protected speech rights at all. And it's kind of their job to determine who is infringing on people's constitutionally protected speech rights. Anyway, whether it's prejudged or not, Trump isn't the one who's conducting the inquiry, is he? So it's the same as before. If it's a decent inquiry and it doesn't give hacky recommendations, then sure. Same question as the last executive order. Do you trust Pam Bondi? If not, this and the last executive order in themselves are weaponizations of government. If you do trust her, then they're great. Play on. I'll leave it up to you. This one is the shortest of them all. The flying flags at half staff executive order. Trump ordered flags to be flown at full staff on all inauguration days, right up the top there, including the current inauguration day. That was a response to Biden trying to fly the flag at half staff on inauguration day because Jimmy Carter died. Sure, why not? Let's move on. Rescinding previous orders executive order. This order rescinded 78 executive orders and memoranda issued by the Biden administration. And I tell you what, it didn't miss many. 8 of Joe Biden's 9 first-day executive orders have been rescinded by this order. 7 of his 10 second-day executive orders were rescinded by this order. 21 of his first 26 executive orders in that first week, 21 of the 26 first week executive orders also rescinded. Then, when you look at the next 23 executive orders after that, it rescinded 16 of them. And he ended off with 17 rescinded orders just from January 2025. All the stuff that Biden tried to sneak in at the end there, all the sneaky stuff, all the Trump proofing, Trump just immediately reversed. Bang. So that's how it goes, I guess. We're talking public health regulations, voter registration regulations, environmental regulations. There's too many to go through, even on PEEP, especially given that we're probably about 1 hour 50 in. But a few interesting ones do stand out, which I will note for you. EO 13989. That's ethics commitments by executive branch personnel. This was a Biden executive order that required members of the executive branch to sign an ethics pledge stating that they would not receive gifts from lobbyists or lobbying organizations. It also banned government employees from working on regulations and contracts related to their former employer or clients from the previous 2 years before they joined the government. It also banned lobbyists from working on regulations and contracts related to the issue area they lobbied in. Dare I say it kind of drained the swamp. Now, if Trump really cared about draining the swamp, he should have kept that one. In fact, when Trump first started in 2017, he had an even stronger rule. He prevented his government employees from lobbying for 5 years after they left government. But then he repealed that in 2021 on his way out when he and those said government employees were all on their way out the door to the said lucrative lobbying jobs. So he said at the beginning, when you leave, no lobbying jobs for 5 years. But then when they left, he said, yeah, sure, Go have some lobbying jobs. So that was a little bit disillusioning. Not that that order was well enforced even when it was in place. But anyway, my point is, he said he was going to drain the swamp. He didn't. Biden did do a bit of draining the swamp, and Trump just repealed it. Another interesting one, EO 14006, reforming our incarceration system to eliminate the use of privately operated criminal detention facilities. This is saying the government shouldn't contract with private prisons. At the time, about 14,000 federal prisoners were in private prisons. Most of them were undocumented immigrants. This one's notable, though. The reason I'm saying this, the rescinding of this particular memo, is notable because it's a sign that Trump is readying himself for an explosion in private prisons to deal with illegal immigration. That's what people associate private prisons with, illegal immigration. So it's kind of playing his hand there, what he's planning to do to take care of all these illegal immigrants being processed. It's also notable that Pam Bondi is an ex-private prison lobbyist. Geo Group was one of her clients. So I wouldn't be surprised when you add that to the illegal immigration thing. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a huge number of people in private prisons in 4 years' time. And the last one I'd like to single out, EO 14087, lowering prescription drug costs for Americans. This one from Biden was encouraging Medicare to help lower prescription costs. Not only does this contradict what Trump says he believes in, repealing this, because Trump says he believes in lowering prescription drug costs, I can't imagine why he would repeal this. Does he want the government to spend more money on Medicare? That hurts him. What's the point? I don't understand. That's weird. I've talked enough about that. Let me move on so I can get a few more done before we run out of time. Revoking security clearances. This is an executive order that comes in two parts. Part one is the bit about the Hunter Biden laptop, the letter that was signed by 51 security officials, former security officials. So what this says, this executive order, is that this order directs the revocation of any active or current security clearances held by the former intelligence officials who engaged in misleading and inappropriate political coordination with the 2020 Biden presidential campaign. So those 51 former intelligence officials, they signed a letter in 2020 saying that the leaking of information purportedly from Hunter Biden's laptop had, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. These people included former CIA Director John Brennan, former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, etc., etc. So what's the case for this executive order against these guys? The letter went public on October 19, 2020, less than a week after the New York Post's first report about Hunter Biden's laptop, and only about 2 weeks before the election. So it could have influenced the election outcome. It was also directly before a presidential debate in which Biden used that letter as his main defense to undermine concerns about the Hunter Biden scandal. Once again, that could affect the election. Obviously, it now appears that the laptop was actually Hunter Biden's laptop, but people can be wrong, can't they? Why would you punish these people for being wrong? Unfortunately, it did come out a few years after this that the way those 51 former national security officials were recruited for the letter was by Anthony Blinken, who was Biden's campaign advisor at the time. He'd called former CIA Deputy Director Michael Morrell, and Morrell at the time was hoping to be Biden's CIA director, and Blinken knew that. So Biden's, a guy from his campaign, one of his senior advisors, contacts someone who he knows hopes to get a gig with the administration. And he clues Morrell up, trying to get him to do this letter. Morrell later testified that the letter was designed to, quote, help Vice President Biden in the upcoming presidential debate by giving him, quote, a talking point to push back on Trump on the issue. So Morell admits this is all about trying to influence the debate. Why would he help Biden? Because I wanted him to win the election, Morell said. He also said he hadn't even considered working on that letter until Blinken called him. So then he went about getting former national security officials to sign on. It makes the letter look very much like the security officials abused the status associated with having security clearances to achieve political ends in coordination with a presidential campaign. It looks kind of corrupt, doesn't it? That's the reason why that's the case for removing their security clearances. All right. What's the case against? Firstly, John Brennan says the EO, it's a real old McDonald vibe every time I say EO. Brennan says the executive order has misrepresented completely what they did. The executive order says signatories of the letter falsely suggested that the news story was part of a Russian disinformation campaign. And Brennan says, no, we said it was one of the hallmarks of Russian information operations, including the dumping of accurate information, which is what we said in that letter. Was it? Why don't we read the relevant bits of the letter together, shall we? He reckons everything they said was true. Strictly speaking, it was true, even to this day. So let's read it together. We write to say that the arrival on the US political scene of emails purportedly belonging to Vice President Biden's son Hunter, much of it related to his time serving on the board of the Ukrainian gas company Burisma, has all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. So far, what Brennan's saying is true. We want to emphasize that we do not know if the emails provided to the New York Post by President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, are genuine or not, and that we do not have evidence of Russian involvement, just that our experience makes us deeply suspicious that the Russian government play a significant role in this case. If we're right, this is Russia trying to influence how Americans vote in this election. And we believe strongly that Americans need to be aware of this. He's right. Everything he said there is true. They are truly stating their opinions. And if those opinions were right, it would be very concerning. And it would mean what they just said it meant. So that's interesting. Other than that section, by the way, the rest of the letter was just the logic supporting their view. And that logic was all public information, totally reasonable. So, what they're saying, what they wrote was strictly speaking true, but was it irresponsible? Obviously, they were trying to imply certain things, even though what they were saying was to the letter accurate. You make up your own mind if you think it was irresponsible or not. The press certainly lapped it up and ran with it in the way they wanted them to. The first report on it in Politico was headlined, Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say. And maybe that's exactly what they intended to happen. To say things that are strictly accurate, but make implications that let everyone else make the leap for them. But I've got to say, what they wrote, in my view, wasn't actually irresponsible. You can disagree if you want. I think Trump's obsession with this seems like an overreaction. I understand if you disagree. But let me say, generally speaking, Trump has a lot of authority when it comes to security clearances. Regardless of whether Trump's overreacting or not with that letter, he's got a lot of leeway when it comes to security clearances. Even if I disagree with his reasons, the fact that he has reasons at all is pretty much enough for him to remove those security clearances. So it's a pretty low bar. There is just one thing though, and that is that this could be a violation of the First Amendment. Let me explain why. This here is clearly a punishment. Some of these people would presumably need security clearances to do their jobs. So it's depriving them of their livelihood. Punishment. And the fact that Trump is very openly punishing these people for expressing their views about the Hunter Biden letter seems to me like a clear-cut case of breaching the First Amendment. The lawyer of 8 of the 51 signatories, Mark Zaid, made exactly this point. He said, "It'd be contrary to decades of national security norms to suspend the security clearances of individuals who did nothing other than, as private citizens, exercise their protected First Amendment rights. It's also quite ironic that at the same time this executive order is issued, the White House claims it supports the restoration of freedom of speech and seeks to end federal censorship," which are 2 other executive orders. That is a good point. Anyway, even though Trump normally would have the power to do this, if he is openly flouting the First Amendment, the courts might reverse this move. Not that that's a huge deal. Zaid has also said that, quote, "To my knowledge, few of the 51 even maintain current eligibility or access to classified info. So maybe this decision isn't punishing them after all. Maybe the horse has bolted and they're shutting the gate." Either way, to have a successful lawsuit, they're going to have to establish damage. So if there's no damage, there's no lawsuit. If someone is losing their security clearance and it's hurting them, then I think they've got a First Amendment lawsuit there. So we'll see. Anyway, that's part 1 of the memo. Part 2, much simpler. John Bolton, revoke his security clearance. Why? Because of his book. The executive order says, the book was rife with sensitive information drawn from his time in government. The memoir's reckless treatment of sensitive information undermined the ability of future presidents to request and obtain candid advice on matters of national security from their staff. Publication also created grave risk that classified material was publicly exposed. This is a shocker. Firstly, Bolton did send it for security clearance before it was published. Secondly, what? Trump is complaining about people being loose with classified material? Seriously? The hypocrisy is astounding. But you know what? Despite that, he has the right to do this. We all know this is just a punishment for Bolton criticizing him. Trump also withdrew Bolton's federal security protection, even though Iranians are currently trying to assassinate him because of his work for Trump. Trump is trying to punish John Bolton. He's clearly trying to get revenge because Bolton heard his fee-fees on TV news over and over again. But you prove that that's what's going on in court. You prove that it's not because Trump is worried about how he abused classified information. Trump says he's withdrawing Bolton's security clearance because he's loose with classified info. And that is a good enough reason. That's the law, I'm afraid. I reckon Bolton's security clearance is gone. Resolving delayed security clearances. Now, having suggested that security clearances are very valuable things that shouldn't be handed out lightly in the last executive order, in this executive order, Trump declared a whole bunch of people who so far haven't cleared a security check as being fit for a 6-month security clearance, and he ordered they get one. These people may include people who have had their clearances actively rejected. We don't know. We have no idea whether these people, they just haven't finished the security check or if the security check was negative. All we know is that they're would-be staffers of Trump, or the Trump administration, and they haven't got security clearances yet. So Trump said, just give it to them, 6 months. So that's fun. And to be honest, it's kind of Trump's fault there's a delay as well. The FBI began the process of running security checks on people several months late because Trump took so long to provide enough information to them and to sign the necessary ethics forms for the FBI to begin their work. So that's his fault. Honestly, if you're asking my opinion about this, I find it hard to comment because I'd need case-by-case info. Every case is different. So I'm going to leave that. This is a fun one. Classic architecture exec order. Did you hear about this one? It's another call for a report. Just an odd report. Trump's looking for recommendations to advance the policy that, quote, federal public buildings should be visually identifiable as civic buildings and respect regional, traditional, and classical architectural heritage in order to uplift and beautify public spaces and ennoble the United States and our system of self-government. And he put out basically the same report in his first term as well. Why? I've no idea. Some say that online nationalists are really into architecture. Who knew? Maybe it is a base pleaser. I don't know. Maybe Trump is just a classical architecture enthusiast. I have no idea. Either way, I found that weird. And that's one more executive order ticked off. Memo about California water. This one was called putting people over fish. Stopping radical environmentalism to provide water to Southern California. This continues Trump's long-term obsession with the Delta smelt fish that we told you about at length on PEP194. I quote, I hereby direct the Secretary of Commerce and Secretary of the Interior to route more water from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta to other parts of the state for use by the people there who desperately need a reliable water supply. Reminder, at the very least, the people of LA have a very reliable water supply. Maybe he's talking about San Joaquin farmers, because after all, they're the people who are going to get the water if it's diverted. Either way, this led to the most bizarre moment of this week, when Trump truthed out the following. The United States military just entered the great state of California and under emergency powers turned on the water flowing abundantly from the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The days of putting a fake environmental argument over the people are over. Enjoy the water, California. Huh? There was a military operation in California and they turned on some tap that solved all their problems, and we only heard about this from a Trump truth? Seems sus. Didn't help when White House spokesperson Carolyn Leavitt said this.
Water has been turned back on in California, and this comes just days after President Trump visited Pacific Palisades and, as you all saw, applied tremendous pressure on state and local officials in Pacific Palisades, including Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, to turn on the water and to direct that water to places in the south and in the middle of the state that have been incredibly dry, which has led to the rapid expansion of these fires.
Well, that gave us no information whatsoever, just blather, which continued to confuse the San Joaquin Delta with where the fires are, even though there is no connection at all to that area. So what's the truth then? The California Department of Water Resources tweeted this out. The military did not enter California. The federal government restarted federal water pumps after they were offline for maintenance for 3 days. State water supplies in Southern California remain plentiful. Yeah, I find that account very easy to believe. It hasn't been confirmed by any media though, so who knows? The media just printed Trump's tweet and then that tweet and just said, meh. So what was Trump thinking? Let's assume that he just made that up. What was he thinking? That we wouldn't notice? That the military hadn't invaded California? If indeed that truth was not based on reality, and we shouldn't assume it wasn't based on reality, even though I don't think it was, but if it wasn't based on reality, then that was, in my view, comfortably in the top 5 most senile social media posts that I've ever seen from Trump. Maybe even the top 3. It's right up there. I can't imagine what's going through his head. Anyway, then there was this executive order as well about some of the same elements. It also rabbited on about California water. This is the Improving Disaster Response Executive Order. Basically, it's replicating the Putting People Over Fish Executive Order. This time it added exemptions, though, for the Endangered Species Act to get around killing the smelt once and for all. But also, this was a much more useful executive order because it had lots of other things. It had an OMB review of all federal programs, projects and activities for all relevant agencies that impact land management, water availability, water supply, water storage and delivery, water infrastructure and disaster preparedness and response. It also called for a plan to expedite options for housing relief to survivors displaced by wildfires in California. It also wants to help the rebuilding of areas devastated by the recent Los Angeles wildfires, and it wants a plan to expedite the bulk removal of contaminated and general debris. It's also expediting road clearance, rebuilding and housing relief for survivors of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. There was one, and all that stuff's good, by the way. There was one ominous note, though. He did ask OMB to investigate any lack of compliance by California with the terms of existing federal grants, contracts, or other financial assistance to states or localities, or beneficial additional terms that may be added with respect to any future federal programs, projects, or activities to ensure sound disaster prevention and response. That sounds like it's designed to punish California somewhere down the line with conditions on their aid. That's what it sounds like to me. But, apart from that ending and all the California water stuff at the top, all the middle stuff, that's great. Like, that's good on him. No problems. We're around the 2:15 mark. I was only going to go up to here, so I'm getting tired. You can hear the stutters starting to come in. I am going to do one more. I'll do DOGE because that's what everyone's talking about. This week is all Elon Musk week. Next PEP is going to be all about Elon Musk, I'm sure, and corruption and abuses of power. Let's talk about DOGE, and that will be it for this. Then we'll get into the interview. In many ways, this is the most intriguing executive order, so I'm glad I left it till last. This is the official establishment of DOGE, but it's not what you expect. It doesn't talk about cost cutting or budgeting. This is what it says. The United States Digital Service is hereby publicly renamed as the United States DOGE Service and shall be established in the Executive Office of the President. Okay, well, firstly, what is the US Digital Service? Are we missing it? It's an Obama-era office formed to troubleshoot the Obamacare website. Okay, not missing that. But then it also became a group that recruits private sector talent to improve outdated and inefficient government technology. And at least according to this executive order, that's also what DOGE is going to do. Yeah? Well, this is what it says right at the top of the executive order. This executive order establishes the Department of Government Efficiency to implement the President's DOGE agenda by modernizing federal technology and software to maximize governmental efficiency and productivity. Really? It goes on. The USDS administrator, that's Elon Musk, shall commence a software modernization initiative to improve the quality and efficiency of government-wide software, network infrastructure, and information technology systems. Amongst other things, the USDS administrator shall work with agency heads to promote interoperability between agency networks and systems, ensure data integrity, and facilitate responsible data collection and synchronization. I suspect the phrase, amongst other things in that list, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. And Elon better get moving because this executive order says the US DOGE Service temporary organization shall terminate on July 4, 2026. Okay, what the hell is going on? None of this is what we were told DOGE would be about. So what is happening here? First of all, this defeats a bunch of lawsuits. Everyone was assuming that DOGE was going to be an advisory committee to the president, and they all had ideas of how to thwart it in the courts. But this structure that I just read out is not an advisory committee. Too bad, folks. By contrast, this structure comes with quite a few advantages. They got some good lawyers on this, I reckon. Firstly, it's part of the executive, right? And Musk gets himself a White House office because it's part of the executive. So that means unfettered access. This executive order gives Musk, quote, full and prompt access to all unclassified agency records, software systems, and IT systems. God knows what Elon Musk is going to do with all that. This is a guy who has billions of dollars in government contracts, getting all this juicy information about the way agencies work. That's going to be handy for him. Because it's part of the executive office of the president, Musk is also going to be able to avoid federal hiring rules. He's also going to be able to avoid Trump's hiring freezes. Also, because it's part of the executive office of the president, DOGE is not going to be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Isn't that interesting? Rather, it will be subject to the Presidential Records Act, which makes it way harder for the public to get hold of communications and information. And because it's only a temporary organisation scheduled to sunset in 18 months, the usual staff payment rules don't apply to DOGE. So that means Trump and Musk can hire staff on any basis they like, for any length of time and salary. This is important because Musk wants to hire a bunch of rich guys on a voluntary basis so they don't have to leave their companies. You can't do that under regular government hiring rules. You can do that under the structure that DOGE exists in, the temporary organisation structure. Also, because it's only a temporary organisation, the funding rules are a little bit different. They allow Musk to partly fund it himself, which will only add to the secrecy. And the best part about all this is that because this thing has only got 18 months to run, if you want to challenge any of this in court, good luck. There isn't enough time to go through the court process before DOGE is wound up. So this whole structure is devilishly brilliant. I don't know who came up with it, but it is perfectly designed to create an environment for Musk to do whatever the hell he wants without any accountability whatsoever. And I suspect that what he wants to do won't be promoting interoperability between agency networks and systems, ensuring data integrity and facilitating responsible data collection and synchronization. I haven't had a chance to reply yet, but on the Discord, I saw Lara, one of our commenters, was reminding me, like in good spirit, of the fact that last year I said that Elon Musk probably wouldn't go for a job in the administration because he'd have to, if he wanted confirmation, he'd have to get a security check. He'd have to go through the process of the FBI going through his shit. And confirmation proceedings as well would be a nightmare for him. And so he probably would want to stay hands off. Well, it turns out I was very wrong, because not only did he have to not do any of that, but he gets his plum position and he still gets to float around like a phantom with no accountability whatsoever, doing whatever he pleases, just sprinkling Elon dust all over the administration and putting his flunkies wherever he wants as well. I definitely did not see this coming, and it's bad. One more thing. DOGE's top lawyer, probably the guy who came up with all this shit I've just been telling you, left to work in the private sector this week. About 3 days after DOGE was formed. What's he doing? Like, what's happening? Like, the person responsible for coming up with this monstrosity, for some reason, doesn't even want to be involved with it. Like, what the hell is going on with DOGE? It is so sus and it's such a concern. I would say we will see what it does. But I suspect it's designed for us not to see what it does. So I've got no idea. Anyway, that is definitely enough on executive orders. There actually aren't that many left, but this podcast is going to go more than 3 hours, so I'm winding up. Let's get into the interview. Today's main interview is Alix McLearin, the former National Administrator for Women and Special Populations at the Bureau of Prisons. She was generous with her time. This one goes for about 45 minutes. You would have seen about 8 minutes of it on Planet America, even though I actually recorded it on Zoom for PEP beforehand. There's something else I do have to explain, though, before we start. I've told you this many times before, but while some of the Planet America interviews are live in the studio, most of them are pre-recorded, not in the studio. That's simply because of time difference issues. Most interviews are recorded either at midnight or at 6 or 7 a.m. because of the time in America. Obviously, we don't want to call the studio crew in for huge overtime just to do an interview. So we record it on Zoom. Then we re-ask the exact questions in the studio with the person's head put on a loop, nodding in the studio TV. That's what we're doing. We're talking to just a loop of them just going, yep, yep, yep. And then we record us reacting to their answers. We play their answers in the TV and you see us reacting. It just saves a lot of money if you do that. And it's not just us that does that, by the way. I can tell you for a fact that almost every channel does the same thing when they're interviewing people in the middle of the night, like often Americans. If they do a conducting interview at 3 a.m., they don't come into the studio on Channel 9. No, of course not. They'll just do the Zoom thing as well. Well, they might not use Zoom. They might have a proper kind of satellite recording, but same principle. They will record it somewhere else, and then they'll go into the studio during the day and they'll tape their questions again with the same wording. So that's what happens. I've just destroyed the TV magic for you. The reason I'm telling you this now is because we actually had a bit of a disaster with the Zoom on this interview. My computer crashed straight after the interview as I was trying to save it, and it was all lost, which just, oh my God, just killed me. So we had to use a backup copy, but the backup copy was just of Dr. Alix. It didn't have me on it. You could hear me, but you could only see her. So we could just play you her responses and hear me asking the questions. But that would be boring and kind of weird. I know we get lots of comments going, oh, why did you do that for? So while normally I would just play my original interview completely unedited, I am now going to do a PEP version or PEEP version of what we normally do on Planet America. I'm going to re-record all the questions right here, right now, word for word, as I asked them originally, and Lockie's going to paste them in the right order, I hope. So if you're wondering why I look identical during this interview that's about to happen to what I do right now, and why my voice is throaty like I've just been talking for 2.5 hours, that is why. But now I've destroyed any semblance of TV mystery. Let's begin the interview with Dr. Alix McLearin. Dr. Alix McLearin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first of all, let me just establish some background here. You were in charge of women and special populations at the Bureau of Prisons. So does that mean you were only across trans women prisoners, or did you cover trans men prisoners as well?
Both. I mean, it's a job title. So I was the initial person in that role. It started out as an office focused on incarcerated women, and it grew to include all transgender people and lots of other groups.
I was shocked to find that only 10 trans women prisoners out of 1,300 were actually housed in women's prison in 2023. You never hear that stat anywhere. So how many trans men were housed in men's prisons? Do you remember?
Well, I can't give you an exact number at a point in time, just
of course not,
because it's in the past. I can tell you that it's much more infrequent that an individual asks to be placed at a male facility to affirm their gender, even if they identify as male. We moved one person in that way over the many years that I was involved, and it involved a great deal of planning and preparation around safety and education before we did that. But the majority of individuals that are seeking that kind of a placement and are even considered are people that will feel affirmed if they're at a female facility.
Can I ask, when you say it took a great deal of education, who was being educated?
Everybody. In short, people live and work at a prison. And this is something that is unusual or new to some people. I mean, on the one hand, intersex and transgender people have always been here, amongst the big population of humanity. But to have language to talk about it and actually have laws and policies that govern this topic, that may be new for some people. So I mean, educating the individual themselves in what's it going to be like, how best to fit in and get along, and what to do if there's an issue. I mean, educating the other people that live at that facility where this person is coming in the most basic way, not to identify anybody's privacy concerns or anything like that. And then educating the staff as in like what is appropriate and what is not. Really just a more in-depth version of what we would train everybody on.
So what was the process by which it was determined whether a trans prisoner should be transferred?
So I think there's a myth floating around out there that, anybody in the world can go to prison or jail and just say, I want to go to this facility, and boom, magic. And that's not true, because that's not safe for anybody, whether we're talking about transgender issues or anything else. When a person comes into the custody of a correctional facility, as much information as is available is going to be gathered to make sure that person is placed safely. So when we look at this through the lens of somebody who identifies as transgender, and first, they might not want to go to a gender-affirming facility. Like I said, we have lots of trans men at women's facilities. They've been there the whole time, and they're fine staying there. They're not asking to go. So it's a small number of people that even ask. And we set up a process. We reviewed everything that was out there, which admittedly has grown over time and was maybe a little more sparse in terms of research and information, but legalities. We talked to stakeholders, people that might be affected by this, both inside of our facilities and outside. And we arrived at sort of a measure that puts safety in the front. I mean, I think you keep hearing me repeat this word safety because it's a prism that you want to look through when you work in a law enforcement kind of a setting, like a prison or a jail. So in the end, what we arrived at was that everybody's going to be assessed individually because everybody's a little bit different, right? But we set some benchmarks, if you will. And those were things like getting stable generally. So before you're going to move to a new place where you want to fit in, obviously, if you go there and you can't get along with anybody or they can't get along with you, this wasn't a successful transfer. So are you taking the classes? Are you taking classes? Are you volunteering your time? Are you doing something that is productive for you, that is commensurate with what staff recommend, what is good for your well-being? If you have any mental health issues, are they well managed? And pretty importantly to safety, are you staying out of trouble? If you're getting incident reports for fighting, it probably is not the best time to plunk anybody down in an entirely new environment that's going to garner some attention. So we weren't just looking at the individual, though. And I think that's an important piece. Is another bit of misinformation that seems to be floating around is that it's one person's rights at the expense of everybody else's. And I can't think of a time that I was ever involved with anything like that. That, again, that's not safe, nor is it kind or good or based in science. What's the layout of the facility? In the system that I worked in, we didn't have, say, group showers. We just didn't have those. But if you did, that might be an example of that's not a great place to move somebody because they're going to want some bodily privacy to not immediately draw attention to themselves. What other concerns are there? Is there somebody there that they shouldn't be around for some reason? Who knows what it might be? So we're looking at the big picture. We're making sure somebody has behaved well and managed themselves well and taken their medication and taken the logical steps in a transition that made this a good next move for their personal well-being without doing any harm to anybody else.
Just quickly, you mentioned outside stakeholders that you might consult as well. Are you referring to their family members or other people?
All of that. If we made a list of stakeholders of incarcerated people, you would have friends and family. Yeah. You would have people that occupy positions of policymaking authority. And you would have advocacy groups and maybe scientists or experts in a particular field. And you have the general public. Anyone that works in a prison lives in the world too. And so people ask you about things and talk to you about things, and you see the news, and while you might give different weight to something that is a law or is a scientific fact, I really do mean everybody. We talked to a lot of people about what this would look like and how people would react to it before we made a move, which isn't that unusual. It's not like we only did that with a transgender policy. We would do that with most things that are new when you introduce it to a closed system.
And what happened to a trans woman or trans man prisoner after they're transferred? Are they kept in special environments, or are they just treated like every other prisoner?
The goal would be maybe not exactly that they're treated like every other person, because I don't know that anybody's treated exactly like anybody else, but that, yes, that they join the milieu, if you will, and are able to feel good that, if they are identifying as a woman, that they are now part of the female population. Medication still be available if they're taking medication, or some kind of therapy or supportive services if they're doing that. So those things would follow, but yeah, the goal is we are helping this person affirm their gender identity because they have gender dysphoria, and this makes them, it's a treatment. It makes them feel better. It's an accommodation. There's a million words for it, but yeah, the goal is that they are like anybody else at that facility, with some tiny little caveats.
In hindsight, do you think you ever made a mistake when transferring a prisoner? Was there ever a case where someone's safety was compromised?
Well, first and foremost, I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. So let's just get that out of the way. But yes and no. I think this was always a multidisciplinary team decision for a reason, right? Decisions are better made when you have a variety of perspectives from a diverse group, right? We've got science on that. So, was every placement successful in the way we wanted? No. But do I ever think we rushed to judgment or just didn't take it seriously? Definitely not.
I was also surprised to discover that the Bureau was only spending $150,000 a year on gender-affirming hormone therapy for about 2,000 transgender prisoners. That's only like $7 a year per trans prisoner. So Was that because you were selective with who was allowed to have hormone therapy, or was that because not many trans prisoners wanted hormones?
No, I don't think it's that. Again, it's almost like we're making a Mythbusters list here.
Yeah.
One concern that you hear from people is, oh my gosh, it's taking up all this money to treat people who identify as transgender. No, it isn't. When you look at the variety of medications and the variety of health problems that you see across the spectrum of people in correctional environments, that warrant sometimes expensive medications, like let's look at something like hepatitis C treatment. That can cost thousands of dollars a month. It's just not that costly. And anyone that wants to take medication meets with a prescriber. And so if there's not contraindications and it makes sense, they're going to be prescribed it. I can't say every single person that wanted hormones got them, because that's probably not true. But maybe there's a contraindication medically, or something like that. But it wasn't something that, especially once people got used to the policy and the language and everything, that was a frequent problem, that people were being denied hormones on the long term, and certainly not as a cost saver or anything like that.
There's so many Americans who have been really concerned about trans women prisoners being transferred to women's prisons in particular. That's the cliche, at least, that you see on Fox News, people getting worked up about that kind of stuff. So what would you like those people to know?
It's a falsehood that there is some or one or a group of big burly men putting on lipstick and sneaking their way into women's prisons because they want to rape people. That it's just not factual, and it's so easy to disprove. Has a transgender person ever been accused of engaging in some kind of misconduct or violence, sexual or not? Yes, absolutely. But I'm not aware of a single case where a person said they were transgender, got to a woman's facility and started assaulting people and was not really transgender and got convicted of a crime. Not one.
And now that the system that you spearheaded is about to be cast aside by the new administration, what do you think's going to happen? Do you have concerns?
Yes. Yes, I do. Kind of back to almost repeating myself on safety. When you make a policy about something, it's this multidisciplinary group of people, both at the leadership level and folks that represent the bargaining unit, the line staff. And you're coming in there and trying to figure out what is the best way to give guidance to our staff that promotes the best interests of everybody involved. And so a lot of energy went into that. If you just rip the carpet out, what happens to everybody? One, if you lived at a female facility for many years even, and suddenly you're yanked over to a male facility, and you look very feminine, you're going to stand out. You're certainly at risk for assault. I mean, look, we could talk research all day on the rates of assault of people who are transgender in prison, but suffice it to say there's a risk there, but there's a risk to staff too. Any violence there could be someone caught in collateral damage. What if somebody self-harms them? There's just, yes, it's dangerous. And when you work in an environment like that, I think you want to have expertise gained from experience. You want to have science, and you want to have the law in mind, and really consider, once you have those things kind of giving you the boundaries on what you're going to do, talk to some people and think about how it's going to work, instead of just make a drastic change without thought, because people can and do get hurt.
Yeah. So what are some of the challenges and complications that both trans women and trans men prisoners face in prison that we would never guess?
I mean, look, nobody elected me and said, hey, you're the spokesperson for all this stuff. So I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. So I can tell you things that that I encountered as issues. I mean, one, there's the standing out, right? In the regular world, maybe a transgender person is noticeable, maybe they're not. But I think even the folks that really want to get transferred to a gender affirming facility are a little unprepared for the amount of attention and sometimes the unwillingness of the group to make a space for them. You know, some of the old elementary school, you know, you're not in my friend group kind of stuff can come out. Another thing that I saw was just access to products. And this was more early on until people got used to things. But one of the first things that people want is the underwear that matches their gender. They're starting to style in a certain way. And the first time somebody wanted boxer shorts at the female facility, you know, it was, well, we don't have those. Oh my gosh, what do we do? So there were just little things like that that were easy to solve. But by and large, most people do okay. They find a group to be with and they live their lives.
Now, I know you worked in federal prisons, but do you know what the situation was like in state prisons and local jails? Do they have similar procedures and situations that federal prisons do?
So, to a degree, yes. Before I retired, I actually served as the director of the National Institute of Corrections, which is a DOJ agency that serves state and local. So, you know, I think you know this, we have thousands of correctional systems in the United States. So federal, every state has one, and then there's all these local jails. I had the opportunity to see quite a few of them and get some boots on the ground experience outside my own system in that role. And while I certainly didn't see every place, what I can say writ large is it varies a lot. The bigger systems, look, they have more resources. They're often in urban centers. You know, if you're talking like a big jail in New York or in Boston or, you know, places like that. And so they're generally going to be further along on having some kind of a policy. A lot of systems have a policy that allows gender affirming housing. A lot of them do. They do not all. And, you know, one of the things I did as director of NIC was talk to our constituency, which was all the people that worked in jails and prisons, and see what they needed, because we provided training and technical assistance and things like that. And guidance on doing a better job with transgender people was a frequent topic. We actually worked on a product, just sort of how to do the best practices along the way, you know, at intake and during the course of a stay and preparing for reentry. So I think by and large, either systems had a policy or they wanted to have a good policy. With that said, there are a couple of states that have passed laws that forbid anybody from being housed at a gender affirming facility. Those have been challenged legally, but as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a decision in any of those cases as to whether that law can stand or not.
So if you're trying to run things in a prison, say in a state where you're not allowed to house a transgender prisoner in the facility they want to be in, how do you adjust their conditions to deal with that? What can you do?
Well, I mean, obviously, your options just got really limited. Unfortunately, what that is likely to result in is having to put some of those folks into a confined setting, into a segregation, a restrictive housing. Look, we, both in the federal system and in many other systems, there are plenty of transgender people that are doing just fine and don't want to transfer, right? So that is in fact the bulk of the people. And obviously those folks, I won't say they all do okay, because they don't, because we talked about, you know, the risks of violence and sexual assault and all these things that tell us they don't all do okay. But some people will be able to navigate it better than other people. I think you involve your psychologists. I think you educate your staff so that they are looking out for predation. And I think you talk to the lawyers in your system, because we have something called the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And it's a federal law here, and it says that you shouldn't be blanket housing people who are transgender. You're supposed to be making case-by-case decisions. So in addition to trying to do the best you can with the individual that is before you in this hypothetical, I think that's why there are challenges. Not that I'm a lawyer, I'm a psychologist, but it's a tough situation. And look, correctional professionals generally want to do a good job and keep people safe. So maybe pick a cellmate that is safe, protective, maybe encourage the person to be involved in programming, and you know, stay out of places where bad things happen inside the prison.
Now, you've referred a few times to the prisoners who don't want to be transferred to a prison that matches their gender identity. If you could just very roughly here give us an estimate of the proportions of trans prisoners who want to be transferred versus those who just want to keep their transgender status quiet and just keep it to themselves, and those who are happy to be out and proud as a transgender person in a prison that doesn't match their identity. What are the rough proportions between those three groups?
I mean, I can do it visually. People who are happy not to transfer, people who really want to transfer. We're talking a tiny fraction of a fraction, right? We've got this in the federal system, correctional population, I don't know, 150,000, give or take. And you've got maybe 2,000 people that have identified as transgender. Maybe there's some people that consider themselves transgender and they didn't identify. Everybody's identity and transition, they all look different, right? So, okay, we've got 2,000-ish people that even want to be identified in this way. And we're talking things that you could count in a given year, you know, 20 people ask for a transfer. It's just a tiny, tiny fraction, you know, less than 5% if I was ballparking it, but I can't do that much math in my head.
That's okay. You've already said that there were many fewer trans men wanting to transfer than trans women wanting to transfer. That's right, yeah? Did you ever catch someone who was faking being transgender because they just wanted to be transferred? And how hard is it to spot a fake?
When you look at the many avenues available to people to do something bad, because I would assume your motivation was bad if you were faking it to get a transfer, I mean, that's a steep hill to climb. So you want to go to a female facility so badly, you're going to take hormones and do all these things and live your life in a way that is not true to you for a year, sometimes years, just to get there when there's females that work in your facility every day. That it seems insane to me, but also I never saw it happen.
Just to pick up on something you just mentioned in passing there, which we haven't covered, you said for a year or maybe years. How long does it take to go through this process for transferring?
I would say, again, we're talking in generalities, and that's always really hard to do. One, it's individualized, and that's so key to everything I'm saying that I want to kind of underline it. But the benchmarks we talked about set it at around a year, like a year of stability, a year of taking your hormones in a compliant manner, a year of not only not getting in trouble, but doing some pro-social things that show that you have the requisite interpersonal functioning and skill set to go to a new environment that might be tricky and fit in. It's a failure for everybody if we say fine, transfer, and 5 days later the person has requested protective custody and is miserable and says, bring me back. Nobody won there. So I would say a year at minimum, but look, a lot of the folks that I encountered had been living as their identified gender long before they came into prison. And so sometimes it wasn't a year.
Do you need to go through hormone therapy before you're transferred?
No. But I would say there would need to be a lot of discussion about a case where hormones weren't part of the equation. But it is not it's not an absolute.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, I noticed from your bio that you were also the Prison Rape Elimination Act coordinator, so it was your job to help prevent sexual assault as well. Now, people like J.K. Rowling, they have us believe that trans women prisoners are just going around sexually assaulting their cis women prison counterparts at will. What did you find when it came to both trans women and trans men prisoners either sexually assaulting someone else or being sexually assaulted themselves?
Not that. Look, sexual assault, and I don't want to make light, is a serious and awful thing, whether it happens in prison or out. But my experience was trans folks were much more likely to be an alleged victim than an alleged perpetrator. And so again, that there's an exception for every rule for, all the gotcha folks out there. No, that wasn't generally my experience. Doesn't mean nothing untoward ever happened. Of course not. But victimized more than victimizing.
When you're making a decision about whether to transfer a prisoner, I know as a team, not as an individual, could you take me briefly through the pros and cons of the alternative options? Like, what are the things you're thinking about that could go right or could go wrong with either option?
Look, prison, jail, corrections, that's a risk-averse environment generally, right? Nobody wants anything bad to happen. And just because of the nature of the environment, if something bad does happen, it might be something very bad, which can be a little paralyzing if you think about it. However, if you're in a leadership role, there's some responsibility that comes along with that, where in fact you do have to make decisions. So when you come together as a team, you are spending your time gathering information long before you come together as a team. And we did our best to make this very transparent. And spell these things out in policy. A team made up of these different backgrounds will come together and we will look at all this stuff. So we have records from the whole time somebody's been in a prison of incident reports, rule violations, just general functioning. We can talk to the person if we want to. We can talk to the staff that work around the person if we want to. And we can talk to people at the other side of this, like, hey, you would be receiving somebody. How's this gone with other folks at your facility? What's your population like right now? Are your staff supported? So you can't plan for everything in any universe that I know about, but you're trying to do all of the what ifs. But the safety and well-being of both staff and incarcerated person at the top of your what if priority list.
Sure. Now, a few general questions. Other than transgender prisoners, what other prisoners had special arrangements made for them at times?
All sorts of people. if you have a death in your family, you might be considered to go out on a furlough. You might get special phone calls. Everybody else isn't going to get that. If you have, if somebody's living with a disability, we will make accommodations both in the education department, but possibly in the workplace, or in your housing unit. You might need some kind of medical equipment to help you get by. Women, if we have a pregnant woman, we're going to obviously do things differently, maybe allow meals off schedule because you're eating for two. I could probably keep going. It's not that unusual to say, hey, there's a unique need here, whether it be for one person or 1,000 people. How can we best and safely figure this out?
When you think back on your time working in prisons, the prisoner who required the most attention and most special arrangements, do you remember what their special circumstance was?
Honestly, it was not a person that was identified as transgender.
Sure, yeah.
No, one of my early jobs in my career, my first supervisory role was to run a program for people with cognitive impairments. There was a lot of helping out and making the space safe, and working individually with officers that might work on the unit, or saying, well, I know this is happening, but there's a reason for it, and we're working on it in treatment, and let's not blow it up. So it would have been in that role, I think.
Well, that was literally my next question. It was, prisoners who are, say, cognitively impaired or heavily autistic, do they require a lot of accommodation as well?
Potentially. Again, we're going to look at the individual. And so, like, every federal facility has special education services. They're there, they're available if you need them. And if somebody comes in and either through getting to know them or through records, we see a diagnosis like autism, we can either refer them to a program that is where everybody, is living together, working on the same things in a special unit, or we can flag them in some way. We literally have codes in our system that, again, we put in policies so everybody can know, like, yes, this person is coming and they have an issue. And so when they get there, priority to check it out and make sure we have whatever we need to have in place, depending on what the particular issue is, whether it's a mental health problem or a need for a wheelchair or whatever.
What about prisoners who are in prison for committing particularly heinous crimes, like, say, child sex crimes? Did they have special arrangements ever made for them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of the crimes are very bad, and I won't excuse them, so I don't ever want to sound like I am, because no. But a person is not their crime. And the mission of any prison system out there, not just, where I worked, it is something about safe and fair and offering opportunities. So, yeah, if somebody did a terrible crime, but also requires kidney dialysis or, help in the classroom, then they're going to receive it.
Just to be clear, I wasn't meaning they're committing a horrible crime and also they've got a heart problem. I mean, because they committed a horrible crime, they're now in a prison where people know they committed a horrible crime, so they might require protection and they might require segregation and, that kind of thing.
Of course. Got it now. I wasn't following you. Yes. There are different sorts of units and missions, and ways of doing that. And sometimes someone will seek protective custody all on their own, there are many mechanisms by which those cases can be managed, particularly if, it's high profile or something like that.
Right. And are there any other special prisoners who might require transferring at rates which are possibly higher than the rates at which transgender prisoners are transferred?
I mean, transgender prisoners aren't transferred that much, but
Yeah, I'm saying.
transfers themselves aren't unusual, and they occur for all kinds of reasons. Like, you get sicker, you need to go to a place that has more of a hospital setting. You get less sick, you get to go to a different kind of facility. You get in lots of fights, you need to go to a higher security facility. Yes, there's even a fledgling unit that I don't know a lot about, but that is trying to build some kind of services for people with dementia.
As a clinical psychologist who worked for so long in the prison system, do you think prisons work?
Can I just sit here and stare at the wall? It depends what you think the purpose of a prison is.
Okay, let's put aside the fact that it just keeps prisoners out of society. It obviously works to do that. But other than that, do you think they work?
I think if a goal of the system is rehabilitation, that there are definitely programs and systems that have proven that those kind of services are effective. Do they help everybody? No. But I also wouldn't expect that. Nothing does. So is prison the answer to every woe in the world? No. Am I suggesting we need a bunch more of them? No. But do I think for some people going to prison and getting, say, substance use treatment, which is pretty hard to get in the community, but really robust and evidence-based inside the walls of a correctional facility, that people go there and get that, and it was effective, and they are able to come out and join into society? Yeah, I think the facts support that.
You presumably have seen it all and seen every kind of inmate. Do you believe in the death penalty?
No. I thought long and hard about my personal opinions on things, were they relevant? Because something that I think is really important right now in America is this idea of how political the civil service workforce is, the people that work for the government. And when you work for the government, particularly in a higher level position, you are in fact apolitical. It's not that you don't have opinions about things, you're a human. But you are, again, using the science and the law and your expertise and the input of affected parties and trying to make the best decision you can with the information available about whatever it is that you do out there, prison or something else. And I think particularly at this time with what's happening in this country, that's an important caveat. With that said, no, I do not, and I can tell you why. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a long time ago, somebody asked me if I would write a book chapter for like a compendium on corrections that they were doing. And I said, sure, I like writing. And they said, great, we want you to do the death penalty. And I said, that's not my expert area. Yeah, but you're gonna synthesize all the research. You're not giving your opinion. Oh, okay, I can do that. So myself and a co-author did, and I went into it. We'd always had the death penalty, and people that got the death penalty did really bad things, and just kind of accepting, I suppose. And after reviewing for months and months and months, just pounds and pounds and stacks of papers about the death penalty, I came to realize how very flawed it is in terms of who receives it, what their background is, and how, hey, if you are uneducated and poor and maybe of a different race, you're so much more likely. How many people that got the death penalty later were either exonerated or probably didn't do it? How many people had terrible representation, even counsel that fell asleep? And looking worldwide, what countries had it and which ones did not, and how it correlated with their crime rates and their other metrics of happiness and goodness. And that was what I needed. That was a game changer. So no, I do not.
And any last thoughts about how the prison system runs, either for trans inmates or anyone for that matter, that you would like to see changed?
Bring me back. Look, I think by and large, most of the people who are working in the correction system and most of the people who are living in the correction system are either just trying to do their job, just trying to make a change and get back out to the community, just trying to do the right thing. And it's really unfortunate that most of what we hear about are the other side of it. But what I would like to see in corrections is a continued focus on science and what works, and evaluation of things, and a shining of light, a transparency. People should know what you're doing. There doesn't need to be secrets outside of security protections, of course. And if a program or a method or a management technique or whatever it is doesn't work, we should be studying it and chucking it and doing something else. And I think that the more we can create healthy, normal opportunities inside of prison, not just, again, for the people who are incarcerated there, but for the people who work in there. You know, there's some data that suggests that that environment isn't so good for outcomes for the staff members either. If we can make them places that are kind and good, I mean, that sounds so simplistic, but follow the science and treat people like humans and act like humans.
Dr. Alix McLearin, thank you so much for your time and experiences.
Thank you.
Well, that was great from Dr. Alix. Thank you so much for sticking with me till the end of PEEP. It was a long one in the end. Next PEEP, I may finish off the executive orders, or I may just get bored of this whole process. We'll see. We are going to be, people have been asking about guest peppers, and we are going to have the guest peppers on soon. And tripods as well are coming. Melina is coming. Bill is coming. Richie is coming. So look out for that. I just wanted to bed down the new set, the new process before I started to introduce other people. Just one thing. I have seen some early comments from PEP194 comments, and people generally seem to be worried by the idea of the podcast changing if we become an official ABC pod. Now, look, some things would change. I will start observing copyright a little bit more on my clips. We'll probably swear a little less. I'll have to teach Dave how defamation law works. Okay, we'll have to make some changes. But if it's an ABC pod, it is still very much going to be a condition of mine that the podcast stays largely the same. If the ABC don't want to agree to that condition, fair enough. It's their station. I don't want to, I'm not going to try and pollute. Well, I have no choice. I won't be polluting their station and their network and their brand with something they don't want. I'll just take the pod fully private. It's simple. Whatever happens to the pod, it's staying largely the same, within reason. The same feel, the same depth, the same length. I'm not going to be doing 1 hour pods. Right? The whole point of this is to go into depth. So don't worry. I'm not going to throw away this pod. Too much bloody work. Anyway, a big week coming. Till next week, stay peppy.